Welcome back to Dirty Laundry, the place where we do not just air the secrets, we deep clean them. Everyone has a little something they want to hide, a stain they cannot quite wash out. But here we totally embrace the mess. We dive into the most scandalous stories, hidden truths, and ultimate unfiltered drama. Grab your popcorn, sit back, and get ready. Because today our cycle is about to spin out of control. Do not forget to hit that subscribe button before we uncover what is really in the basket. I was driving 85 miles an hour through a rainstorm when I called my wife to tell her my father was dying. She said she was leaving the house right now. She said she would be at the hospital in 15 minutes. And then I heard a steel guitar sliding up a country scale behind her voice, and glasses clinking, and a stranger laughing the way people laugh when they are 2 drinks into a night they have no intention of ending. My wife was not at home. My wife was not on her way to the hospital. And by the time I found out where she actually was, I would discover that the lie she told me that night was the smallest one she had been telling for 16 years. This is the story of how I lost my marriage, exposed a woman who stole from children, and watched my 99-year-old father deliver one last verdict from a reading chair because the bench could no longer hold him, but the law still could. But I am getting ahead of myself. Let me start where it started. I have been a heart surgeon for 35 years. I have held beating hearts in my hands, watched them stutter under my fingertips, felt the exact moment when a life either returned to the world or quietly slipped away from it. I know what emergency sounds like. I know the pitch of a cardiac monitor losing its rhythm, the clipped urgency in a nurse's voice when she says, "Doctor, we are losing him." The particular weighted silence that settles over an operating room when every person in it understands that time has become the enemy. So when my phone rang at 9:47 on a Tuesday night in the second week of January, I did not need to hear the words. My body knew before my mind caught up. I was driving south on Interstate 40 toward Nashville. The Silverado's cab smelled of black coffee gone cold in the cup holder, and the faint cedar scent rising from a cardboard box of my father's old legal books I had picked up from a storage unit that afternoon. Rain came down in long diagonal sheets, the kind that turns every pair of headlights into smeared halos and makes the road feel as though it is dissolving beneath your tires. My father's number lit up on the screen, except it was not my father calling. It was a nurse at Vanderbilt University Medical Center, whose name I would not learn until much later that night. "Sir, your father, Franklin Merritt, was brought in approximately 20 minutes ago with acute respiratory failure. He is stable, but critical. We need a family member present here at the hospital to sign the emergency care authorization before 6 in the morning." I pressed the accelerator past 80, past 85. The wipers beat against the windshield like a metronome set too fast. And I thought about my father at 99 years old lying in a hospital bed that was not his own, breathing through a machine because his lungs had finally decided that nearly a century of faithful labor was enough. I thought about the way he still insisted every single morning on reading the newspaper with a brass magnifying glass he kept in the breast pocket of his robe. I thought about the way he still polished his dress shoes on Sunday evenings, even though he had not stood before a courtroom in over 12 years. I thought about hands that had gripped a gavel for 43 years now lying beneath a thin hospital blanket threaded with tubes. And I leaned harder into the gas. I called Vivian. She answered on the 3rd ring. Her voice was calm, warm, completely unhurried. carrying that particular tone she used whenever she wanted you to believe that everything in the known world was safely under her control. Honey, what is wrong? Dad is in the hospital. Respiratory failure. Vanderbilt. I need you to get there before me. I am still about 40 minutes out. Oh my God. Okay. I am leaving right now. I will be there in 15 minutes. Do not worry, sweetheart. And there it was again. The sound I already told you about. The steel guitar. The glasses. The laughter. All of it floating behind her voice like a backdrop she had forgotten to take down before stepping on stage. Vivian, where are you right now? I told you. Honey, I am heading out the door right now. I will be there soon. She told me she loved me. She told me not to drive too fast in the rain. Then the line went dead. And I was alone with the wipers and the cold coffee and my own breathing, which had become something I needed to govern the way I governed it in surgery. Measured, deliberate. 4 counts drawn in and 4 counts released. Because if I lost that rhythm, I would begin thinking about what I had just heard. And if I began thinking, I would start asking questions I was not ready to answer. And if I let those questions take hold while pushing nearly 90 miles per hour through a rainstorm on a dark Tennessee highway, I would never reach my father at all. I arrived at the hospital at 10:31. The parking lot was nearly deserted. Rainwater pooled in the low spots along the curb, reflecting the amber glow of the emergency entrance lights in long, shivering streaks. I left the truck angled across 2 spaces and walked through the sliding glass doors, and the smell found me the way it always does. That unmistakable blend of antiseptic and recirculated air and something deeper underneath that carries no clinical name, but that every human being who has ever walked a hospital corridor toward a dying parent recognizes somewhere in the center of their chest. 3rd floor, room 317. The hallway stretched out quiet and dim, punctuated only by the soft beeping of monitors behind closed doors and the distant rhythmic squeak of a nurse's shoes on polished linoleum. I pushed open the heavy door, and there he was, Franklin Merritt, 99 years old, retired federal judge of the United States District Court for the Middle District of Tennessee, a man who had once commanded entire courtrooms into silence with nothing more than the way he folded his hands on the bench and looked at you over the rims of his reading glasses. Now he lay propped against 2 thin hospital pillows, an oxygen cannula looped gently beneath his nose, his white hair combed back with care, the way he had always insisted upon even when there was no one left in the room to see it. His eyes were closed. His chest rose and fell in a rhythm that was slow and shallow. And the cardiac monitor beside him traced its green line across the screen in a pattern I could read, the way other men my age read a morning stock report. I lowered myself into the chair beside his bed. I reached over and took his hand. His fingers were cold and impossibly thin, like the pages of a beloved book that had not been opened in many years. His eyes opened. "Douglas, I am here, Dad." He studied my face for a long, quiet moment. Then his gaze moved past me to the doorway, lingered on its emptiness, and returned. "You came alone." It was not a question. It was a ruling delivered from the bench. My father, who had spent 43 years carefully weighing evidence and handing down judgments that reshaped entire families, spoke those 3 words with the same measured certainty he had once used to sentence the guilty and liberate the wrongly accused. Before I could respond, the night nurse appeared in the doorway. She held a clipboard against her chest and regarded me with an expression balanced between quiet sympathy and the practiced neutrality of someone who had learned long ago not to step into the private wreckage of other people's families. "Mr. Merritt, I am glad you made it. I do need to let you know that no other family member has visited tonight. No one." "No, sir. You are the first." The monitor beeped on. My father closed his eyes, and beyond the window of room 317, the rain continued to fall. Steady and unhurried and absolutely indifferent. The way the truth always falls when it has finally made up its mind to be heard. I stood there looking at the nurse whose name tag read Richards, and I felt something shift inside my chest. Not the sharp crack of a thing breaking, but something slower and deeper, like a foundation settling after decades of bearing weight it was never engineered to carry. The kind of structural shift you do not notice until the walls begin showing hairline fractures that cannot be painted over. "No one has come in tonight," she said again, and I could see she was not merely reporting a fact. She was watching me the way medical professionals watch patients when they suspect the real injury has not yet presented itself on any scan. I thanked her. She checked my father's oxygen saturation, adjusted the flow by a quarter liter per minute, made a notation on her clipboard, and left the room. The door closed behind her with the soft click of a latch that sounded in that silent corridor. Like the period at the end of a sentence I was not ready to finish reading. My father had fallen back to sleep. His breathing was shallow but steady, the green line on the monitor tracing a pattern I recognized as stable yet fragile. I pulled out my phone and called Vivian. It rang 5 times. Voicemail. I called again. 4 rings this time. Voicemail. A third attempt. The call went straight to her recorded greeting, which meant she had seen my name on the screen and pressed the button that sends a husband directly into silence. I typed a message. "I am at the hospital. Dad is in room 317. Where are you?" The 2 blue check marks appeared almost instantly. She had read it. 1 minute passed. 2 minutes. 3. Then the gray bubble with its 3 pulsing dots appeared, vanished, appeared again, and her reply finally arrived. "Almost there, honey. Traffic is just terrible in this rain. Be there very soon. Love you." I set the phone on the arm of the chair and stared at it. In 35 years of cardiac surgery, I had learned a principle that never once failed me. The human body does not lie. You can ask a patient if she is in pain, and she might smile and say no. But her blood pressure will betray her. Her pupils will betray her. The thin film of sweat forming on her upper lip will tell you what her words refuse to. The body is an honest and relentless witness, even when the mouth has every reason not to be. I sat with that thought for a long while, wondering whether the same principle might apply to a marriage. At 11:14, my phone buzzed with another message from Vivian. "Just got here. Parking now." She added a small red heart at the end, something she had started doing roughly a year ago, a habit I had always found endearing. But now, sitting in the blue glow of a hospital room where my father was fighting for each breath, that tiny symbol looked less like affection and more like a carefully placed prop in a performance I had been applauding for 16 years, without once thinking to look behind the curtain. I waited. 15 minutes passed. 20. At 11:40, I rose and walked to the nurse's station and asked whether my wife had checked in downstairs. The night supervisor, a woman named Ursula with the kind of even-tempered calm that only years of graveyard shifts can build, glanced at her computer screen and shook her head. "No visitor has signed in under merit or any related name since your own arrival, sir." I felt my jaw tighten. I returned to my father's room and sat down and forced myself to think the way I think when I am standing over an open chest, without sentiment, without narrative, without the elaborate stories we construct around the people we love to make their behavior fit the version of them we need to believe in. Just data, just what is observable, measurable, and verifiable. At 11:58, I took the elevator to the ground floor and found the security desk. A man named Derek sat behind a bank of monitors, a steel thermos of coffee beside his keyboard, and a worn paperback novel turned face down on the counter. He was perhaps 40 years old, with the patient, unhurried manner of someone who had witnessed every variety of human behavior a hospital at midnight has to offer, and had long since stopped being surprised by any of it. I told him who I was. I explained that my wife claimed to be in the building, but that no one on the 3rd floor had seen her. I asked if there was any record of her entering tonight. He typed a short query into his system. He paused. Then he turned the screen so I could see it. There was a single log entry. Vivian Merritt. Arrived 10:09. Departed 10:13. Total duration inside the building, 4 minutes and 47 seconds. She had come and gone 22 minutes before I arrived. I read that number 3 times. 4 minutes and 47 seconds. I have performed cardiac catheterizations lasting 6 hours. I have stood over open chests for 9 hours without sitting down or eating or looking at a clock. I once held a dying man's heart in my palm for 11 minutes, while my team fought to repair a ruptured aorta. And during those 11 minutes, I did not blink, did not shift my weight, did not permit a single tremor to travel through my fingers. My wife had given my dying father 4 minutes and 47 seconds, and then she had left before I could arrive to see her do it. Derek offered, without my asking, to pull the security footage. "Camera 4B, he said, covers the east corridor on 3 and the entrance to room 317. He found the timestamp and pressed play. The image was grainy, black and white, but clear enough. There was Vivian walking down the hallway in a dark coat and heels that no one wears to a hospital. She pushed open the door to my father's room at 10:09 and 19 seconds. She stepped inside. 4 minutes and 47 seconds later, she reappeared holding her phone in front of her face at a slight downward angle, reviewing something she had just recorded. She turned left toward the elevator and was gone. She had not stopped at the nurse's station. She had not spoken to a single staff member. She had not signed the emergency authorization form still sitting on the counter where the admitting nurse had placed it. Derek paused the footage. She was in the room just under 5 minutes. That is everything I have. I asked about interior cameras. He told me patient rooms have none. But the hallway angle showed her approaching the bed, raising her phone, and recording for roughly 15 seconds before turning to leave. 15 seconds. A video of herself standing beside a 99-year-old man fighting for every breath. Not a prayer. Not a word spoken to him. Not her signature on the document that would authorize the team to do what was needed to keep him alive. And then she had walked out and spent the next hour texting me that she was almost there, that traffic was terrible, that she was parking now, sending me a red heart from wherever she actually was, while my father lay alone in a room she had already visited and dismissed. I thanked Derek. I rode the elevator back to the 3rd floor. I sat down in the chair beside my father and studied his face, the deep lines framing his mouth, the thin, translucent skin at his temples where blue veins mapped a century of living. And I understood with a calm so total it frightened me that I did not know the woman I had been married to for 16 years. I had never known her. My phone buzzed one final time that night. A message from Vivian. Had to step out for a bit. We'll be back first thing in the morning. Dad looked peaceful. Try to get some rest, sweetheart. Dad looked peaceful. She had written those 3 words, knowing exactly what they meant, and knowing that I did not. She had seen him. She had stood over his bed and recorded a video and left without signing a single document. And now she was using what she had seen as proof of presence, as though 4 minutes and 47 seconds of silence in a dying man's room constituted care. I placed the phone face down on the armrest. I did not reply. For the first time in 16 years of marriage, I did not answer my wife. I left the hospital at 6:22 in the morning, after signing every document the medical team required. My father was sleeping, his vitals holding in a narrow corridor between stable and precarious that I knew from experience could persist for days or collapse within the hour. I told Nurse Richards I would return by noon. She nodded and wrote my cell number on a yellow sticky note and pressed it to the edge of his chart. And something about that small, ordinary gesture, a stranger taking care to remember how to reach me in case my father needed me, made me want to sit back down in the chair and never leave. But I needed to go home. Not to sleep. Not to shower or change clothes or do any of the things a reasonable man does after spending a night in a hospital chair with his jaw clenched and his mind running calculations he did not ask it to run. I needed to walk through the house I shared with Vivian and look at it the way I had never allowed myself to look at it before. The way my father would have looked at it. Like evidence. The drive from Vanderbilt to our home in Belmead took 14 minutes. The rain had stopped overnight, and the streets were slick and silver under a sky the color of old pewter. I pulled into the driveway and sat in the truck for a long moment, staring at the house. A Georgian colonial with black shutters and a limestone portico that Vivian had insisted upon when we moved in 16 years ago. She said it communicated permanence. I remember thinking at the time that it was a strange word to use about a doorway, but I wrote the check and the stonemasons came and the portico went up and I never thought about it again. That was the pattern of our entire marriage. Vivian decided. I provided. The arrangement had seemed natural for so long that I had mistaken it for partnership, and I had mistaken partnership for love. The house was empty. Her car was not in the garage. I stood in the kitchen and listened to the silence. which was not the comfortable silence of a home at rest, but the charged silence of a room where something has recently been removed. I could smell her perfume, faint and expensive, lingering near the coffee maker. A single wineglass sat in the sink, unwashed, with a crescent of lipstick on the rim. I noted the color without meaning to. It was darker than what she normally wore. I began in the study. Her laptop was gone, which I expected. The desk drawers held nothing unusual, just foundation stationery and board minutes and a leather folder of tax receipts organized by quarter. Vivian was meticulous about surfaces. Everything visible was in perfect order. Everything you could see told you exactly the story she wanted told. I moved upstairs to the bedroom. Our bedroom. Though standing in it now, it felt like a room I was visiting for the first time. I opened her closet, which was the size of a small bedroom itself, and looked at the rows of dresses and coats and shoes arranged by color and season with a precision that now struck me less as elegance and more as control. I did not know what I was searching for. I only knew that the woman who had spent 4 minutes and 47 seconds at my father's bedside and recorded a 15-second video of herself doing it had to have left traces somewhere in this house. The body does not lie, and neither does the life built around it. I found the drawer at the bottom of her vanity. It was locked. In 16 years of marriage, I had never noticed it was locked because I had never had reason to open it. That sentence alone could serve as the complete summary of everything I had failed to see. The lock was small, decorative, not meant to withstand any real effort. I went to the garage and retrieved a flathead screwdriver, and I cracked it open with a single firm twist. The wood splintered slightly along the seam, and I felt a pang of something that was not guilt exactly, but closer to the feeling you get when you make the first incision on a patient and understand that whatever you find inside, the body will never be quite the same. The drawer was deep. Inside it, arranged in 2 neat rows, were envelopes. White envelopes, each one addressed in my own handwriting. I recognized them immediately. Over the years, I had written Vivian 14 letters by hand, not emails, not text messages, letters, written on heavy cotton stationery with the fountain pen my father had given me when I completed my surgical residency. I wrote the first one on our wedding night, the second on our first anniversary. I wrote one when she launched the Harmony Arts and Education Foundation, and I told her I was proud of the woman she was becoming. I wrote one from a hotel room in Chicago after a medical conference where I had spent the entire evening thinking about her laugh and the way it changed the temperature of any room she entered. I wrote one the night I lost a patient on the operating table, a child, and came home unable to speak and sat at my desk and poured everything I could not say out loud onto the page because I believed that my wife would read it and understand. 14 letters spanning 14 years of a marriage I believed was built on devotion and mutual trust, and the quiet daily act of choosing each other. Every single envelope was still sealed. I picked up the first one, the wedding night letter, and turned it over in my hands. The flap was untouched. The adhesive had never been broken. She had kept it for 16 years in a locked drawer at the bottom of her vanity, and she had never once opened it to read what her husband had written to her on the night they promised each other everything. I went through them one by one. All 14. Sealed. Every last one. Some had yellowed slightly with age. The earliest ones had my old return address on the back, from the apartment we lived in before the Bellmead house. They were artifacts of a man who believed his words were landing somewhere, that the woman he loved was holding them and reading them and carrying them with her the way he carried her presence with him into every operating room and every long night on call. She had never read a single one. I set them down on the vanity in a row, and I sat on the edge of the bed, and I looked at them. These small white rectangles that contained the most honest version of myself I had ever committed to paper. And I understood something that the security footage and the steel guitar and the 4-minute visit had only hinted at. Vivian had not betrayed me last night. She had been betraying me from the very beginning. The only thing that had changed was that I had finally opened a drawer she assumed I would never touch. I sat there for a long time. Light moved slowly across the bedroom floor as the morning pushed through the curtains. Then I looked back at the open drawer. The envelopes were gone from it now, spread across the vanity. But this drawer was not empty. There at the bottom, resting on the bare wood like a secret that had been waiting years for someone to find it, was a phone. A slim black device I had never seen before, powered off, with no case and no scratches, placed there to remain hidden and to remain clean. I picked it up and pressed the power button, and the screen lit white and asked for a 6-digit passcode. I did not know the code, but I knew someone who could get past it. And for the first time in 16 years, I was willing to ask. I set the phone aside. I would need help with it, and I knew exactly who to call. But that conversation could wait until I had finished searching this house with the thoroughness it deserved. A surgeon does not stop the procedure when he discovers the first complication. He maps the entire field before deciding where to cut. I went back to the study. Vivian's primary laptop was gone, as I had already noted. But I remembered something. 2 years ago, she had upgraded to a newer machine and asked me to store the old one. I had placed it on the top shelf of the hallway closet behind a set of winter blankets, because that was where things went in our household when Vivian decided they were no longer part of the visible narrative of our life. I found it exactly where I had left it. A silver MacBook with a small dent on the left corner from when she had dropped it, getting out of a taxi in Midtown Manhattan. I carried it to the kitchen table, plugged it into a charger, and opened the lid. The battery icon pulsed once. The screen came to life. And because Vivian had retired this machine before she began whatever campaign of concealment she was now conducting, the device was still logged into her iCloud account. Her messages, her calendar, her photographs, all of it synced and preserved like a fossil record of the woman she had been before she learned to cover her tracks on newer hardware. I opened the Messages application. The most recent sync was from 11 months ago, which meant I was looking at a window into roughly the right period. I scrolled through the usual names: board members, foundation staff, her hair salon, her personal trainer. And then a name I did not recognize appeared in a thread that stretched back 8 months and contained over 400 messages. Nathan Voss. I did not know a Nathan Voss. In 16 years of marriage, Vivian had never mentioned a Nathan Voss at a dinner party, never referenced him in conversation. never brought his name home the way spouses do when they acquire a new colleague or friend. He existed entirely outside the life she had shown me, which meant he existed inside the life she had hidden. I began reading from the oldest message and worked forward. The early exchanges were careful, almost professional. A discussion about an arts funding initiative in the Gulch District. References to a shared committee at a non-profit board. The language was measured and appropriate, and could have been shown to anyone without raising suspicion. But there was a rhythm to it that I recognized from my years of reading cardiac monitors. The baseline looked normal, but the intervals were shortening. The exchanges were becoming more frequent. The responses were arriving faster. Something was accelerating beneath the surface. By the third month, the language had changed. Pet names appeared. Private jokes I could not decode. A photograph of a sunset over the Cumberland River with the caption, "Wish you were sitting here beside me." And then, on a Tuesday evening in May at 9:23, a message from Nathan that read simply, "Last night was everything. I have not stopped thinking about you since you left." Vivian's reply came 4 minutes later. "Neither have I. But we need to be careful. Dee leaves for the cardiology conference in Boston on Thursday. I will have the whole weekend. Dee." She had reduced me to a single letter. Not Douglas. Not my husband. Just Dee. A minor logistical obstacle to be scheduled around, like a dentist appointment or a traffic delay. I kept reading. The pattern was systematic. Over the 8-month window preserved on this machine, I counted 23 instances where Vivian's meetings with Nathan coincided exactly with my travel for medical conferences and surgical consultations. 23 trips I had taken believing that my absence was a sacrifice I was making for my career and my family. 23 departures where Vivian had kissed me at the door and said she would miss me and to call when I landed safely. And then I discovered something that made the affair itself seem almost quaint by comparison. I opened the calendar application. Vivian used it religiously, color-coding every category of her life with the organizational precision of a woman who understood that control requires structure. Blue for foundation events, green for personal appointments, red for what she labeled family time, a phrase that now carried a bitterness I could taste at the back of my throat. But there was a fourth color I had never seen before. Gray. And the gray entries were all identical. Each one contained a single line of text. Send scheduled message to D. I cross-referenced the gray entries against my message history with Vivian. The correlation was perfect. Every warm text she had sent me during my travels, every "I miss you tonight" and "thinking of you and the house feels empty without you," had been composed in advance, loaded into a scheduling application, and transmitted automatically at 9:15 each evening while she was somewhere else, with someone else doing something I could no longer afford to imagine in detail. She had automated her affection. She had turned our marriage into a program that ran itself while she attended to what she actually cared about. I was not a husband. I was a process running in the background of her real life, maintained with minimum input to prevent a system error that might attract attention. I sat at the kitchen table with the MacBook open in front of me and the winter light coming through the window, and I felt something I had not felt since the night I lost my first patient at the age of 31. That night I had stood in the scrub room and stared at my hands and understood for the first time that skill and devotion were not always enough to save what mattered. The feeling was not anger. It was not grief. It was the cold, specific clarity that arrives when every comforting story you have told yourself is suddenly and permanently revoked. I was about to close the laptop when I noticed one final exchange near the bottom of the thread. It was from Nathan to Vivian, sent on a Wednesday afternoon in late November, just 6 weeks before my father's hospitalization. The scholarship file for the Reyes girl. You need to make sure it is gone before the January board meeting. If anyone pulls the records and sees what was redirected, we are both finished. Vivian's response was 3 words. Already handled it. I read those 2 words, and I understood that whatever I had uncovered in this kitchen was not the bottom of anything. It was the surface. And somewhere far below it, in a place I had not yet reached, a child I had never met was paying the price for my wife's architecture of lies. I closed the laptop. I picked up the dead phone from the vanity upstairs. I put both devices in my briefcase, took my car keys from the hook by the door, and drove toward the office of a man named Theo Brandt, whose particular skill set I had never imagined I would need, and whose number I had saved in my contacts 3 years ago after a hospital colleague mentioned him in passing as the best digital forensics specialist in Nashville. I was going to need the best. Theo Brandt operated out of a converted warehouse on the east side of the Cumberland River, the kind of building that looks abandoned from the street, but hums with purpose once you step inside. He was 32 years old, lean and quiet, with the focused demeanor of a man who spent his days reconstructing digital lives that other people had tried very hard to erase. I handed him the phone and the MacBook. He asked no questions about why. He simply wrote a receipt on a yellow legal pad, told me he would need 48 hours, and walked me to the door. I liked him immediately. He understood that some situations do not require conversation. I drove back toward Vanderbilt to check on my father, but on the way, my phone rang. The caller identified herself as Helen Marsh. She said she was a retired music teacher, that she had worked for 31 years in the Metro Nashville public school system, and that she had gotten my number from a mutual acquaintance at the hospital, whose name she would rather not share over the phone. Her voice was steady, unhurried, and carried the particular authority of a woman who had spent 3 decades commanding the attention of children and had never lost the habit. She said she needed to speak with me about my wife's foundation. She said it was urgent and that it concerned a child. She asked if I could meet her that afternoon. I almost said no. I had a father in the hospital and a marriage unraveling in my hands, and a forensic specialist dissecting my wife's digital history in a warehouse across the river. I did not have room for one more thing. But she had said the word child, and something about the way she said it, quiet and deliberate, like a woman placing a single card face up on a table, told me that whatever she had to say was connected to the message I had read on the MacBook that morning. The Reyes girl already handled it. We met at a coffee shop on Belmont Boulevard at 2 in the afternoon. Helen Marsh was 67 years old, with silver hair pulled back in a loose knot and reading glasses hanging from a beaded chain around her neck. She wore a blue cardigan and no jewelry except a thin gold wedding band. She had already ordered a cup of tea and was sitting at a corner table with a manila folder resting beneath her hands, as though she were protecting it from the wind. I sat down across from her. She looked at me for a long moment, the way teachers look at you when they are deciding whether you are ready to hear something difficult. "Mr. Merritt, do you know who Lily Reyes is?" I told her I did not. I told her I had seen the name once, in a message on my wife's computer, and that I was trying to understand what it meant. Helen nodded slowly and opened the manila folder. Inside was a photograph of a girl. She was 12 years old, small for her age, with dark hair pulled into a ponytail and a serious expression that made her look like someone who had learned early that the world does not hand you things without a reason. She was sitting on a piano bench in what appeared to be a church, her hands resting on the keys with a stillness and precision that even I, a man with no formal musical training, could recognize as unusual. "Her name is Lily Reyes," Helen said. "Her mother Rosa works 2 jobs, house cleaning during the day and overnight stocking at a grocery warehouse on Dickerson Pike. They live in a 2-bedroom apartment on the south side. Lily has been playing piano since she was 6 years old, and she is the most naturally gifted student I have encountered in 31 years of teaching music to children in this city." Helen told me the story in the same measured cadence she must have used to explain tempo and time signatures to 9-year-olds. Lily had no piano at home. Rosa could not afford one, could not afford lessons, could not afford the gas to drive across town to the schools that had practice rooms available after hours. So when Lily was 6, Pastor James at Calvary Baptist on Nolansville Road agreed to let her use the old upright in the fellowship hall every morning before school. Lily arrived at the church at 5:45 each day. She practiced for 1 hour using tutorial videos she watched on a phone with a cracked screen propped against the hymnal rack. She did this 6 days a week for 6 years. By the time she was 10, Helen said, the child was playing Chopin, not simplified arrangements, not student editions, the actual nocturnes, the ballades, the etudes, learned note by note from a glowing screen in an empty church before the sun came up. At 11, Helen submitted an application on Lily's behalf to the Harmony Arts and Education Foundation's annual scholarship program. The scholarship was worth $85,000 over 4 years, enough to cover tuition at the Nashville School of the Arts, private instruction, instrument access, and a modest living stipend for the family. Lily auditioned in person at the foundation's downtown office. She played Chopin's Ballad No. 1 in G minor, a piece that most conservatory students do not attempt until their 3rd or 4th year of formal study. The review panel gave her a unanimous recommendation. Helen showed me the evaluation form. Every box was checked at the highest rating. In the comments section, one panelist had written a single sentence: "This is the most remarkable young musician I have reviewed in 12 years on this panel." The scholarship was approved in September. Rosa Reyes received a formal letter of acceptance signed by the foundation's executive director. Lily was measured for a school uniform. Helen began coordinating the transition paperwork. For 3 weeks, everything was in motion. Then in October, without warning, Rosa received a second letter. The scholarship had been rescinded. The language was vague and administrative, due to a reallocation of funding priorities for the current cycle. "We regret to inform you." No further explanation. No appeal process. No phone number to call. Helen's voice did not waver as she told me this part, but her hands tightened around the manila folder. "I made calls," she said. "I wrote letters. I contacted every board member whose name I could find. No one would speak to me. The foundation's office told me the decision was final and that all records related to the application had been archived. When I asked to see the archived records, I was told they were no longer available." She paused and looked at me across the table with an expression I have seen only a handful of times in my life. Always on the faces of people who have witnessed something unjust happen to someone who could not defend themselves. "Mr. Merritt, your wife did not simply deny this child a scholarship. She erased her every record, every evaluation, every document proving that Lily Reyes ever applied was removed from the Foundation's system. I know this because I kept my own copies. She tapped the manila folder, and there is something else you need to know. Something that will make this harder to hear than anything I have told you so far. She leaned forward slightly. Your wife attended Lily's audition. She sat in the back row of the recital hall. She watched that 12-year-old girl play Chopin's first ballad from memory for 11 minutes. And when Lily finished, your wife was crying. I saw it with my own eyes. She wiped her face and left the room before anyone could speak to her. 3 weeks later, she personally authorized the removal of every trace of Lily's name from the Foundation's files. Helen sat back and folded her hands. She knew exactly what she was destroying. Mr. Merritt, that is what I needed you to understand. Theo Brandt called me at 7:14 the following morning. I had spent the night in the chair beside my father's hospital bed, sleeping in fragments of 20 and 30 minutes between the soft alarms of the oxygen monitor and the quiet footsteps of the overnight nursing staff. My father had opened his eyes twice during the night. The first time he looked at me and said nothing. The second time he reached for my hand and held it for several minutes, and then said, in a voice so thin I had to lean forward to hear it, "You are doing what needs to be done." I did not ask how he knew. My father had spent 43 years reading people from the bench. He did not require an explanation to understand that his son was in the early hours of an investigation. Theo said the extraction was complete and that I should come to the lab when I was able. I checked my father's vitals, spoke with the morning nurse, a young woman named Carter, who carried herself with the quiet competence of someone who had chosen her profession out of genuine vocation rather than default. And I drove across the river. The warehouse looked the same from outside. Inside. Theo had arranged everything on a long steel table beneath fluorescent lights that gave the room the feeling of an operating theater, which I found oddly comforting. There were 2 laptops open, a series of printed documents arranged in chronological rows, and the black phone I had found in Vivian's drawer, now powered on and connected to an external monitor that displayed its contents in a format I could read. Theo began without preamble. He was the kind of man who respected urgency by refusing to waste time on anything that was not the thing itself. "The MacBook confirmed what you already found," he said. "The iMessage thread with Nathan Voss spans 8 months. 417 messages total. I have exported the complete transcript with timestamps and metadata. Every message is geotagged, which means I can tell you exactly where both parties were when each message was sent and received." He turned one of the laptops toward me and scrolled through a map overlay. Blue dots for Vivian, red dots for Nathan. The pattern was unmistakable. 23 clusters where both sets of dots converged at the same location on the same date. Each cluster corresponding precisely with a medical conference or consultation trip listed on my own calendar. Hotels in Boston, a rented house in Savannah, an apartment in the Gulch district of Nashville that I later learned Nathan owned under a property management company registered to his brother. Theo continued. He pulled up a second screen showing Vivian's calendar data, including entries that had been deleted, but which he had recovered from the device's local cache. The gray-coded entries I had seen, the ones labeled Send Scheduled Message to D, numbered 41 in total across the 8-month window. Each one was linked to an automation application that Vivian had configured to send a specific text message to my phone at 9:15 in the evening. The messages rotated through a library of 12 pre-written templates. "Missing you tonight. The house is so quiet without you. Thinking about you, sweetheart. Cannot wait for you to come home. 12 versions of simulated devotion, cycling on a schedule like a sprinkler system, watering a garden that nobody actually lived in. I asked Theo about the iCloud keychain reset that the hospital's timeline had suggested. He nodded and brought up a log file. At 9:23 on the night your father was admitted, 24 minutes before the hospital called you, someone initiated a full keychain reset on your wife's primary iCloud account. This is not a routine action. It requires deliberate manual input, and it effectively locks out any device previously authorized to access the account. In practical terms, it means that if you or anyone else had been logged into a shared family account or had access to her passwords through a synced keychain, that access was severed. She was sealing the doors before the emergency even began, 24 minutes before the hospital call, which meant that Vivian had known something was going to happen that night, or at the very least had anticipated that the evening would produce circumstances requiring her digital life to be inaccessible. Theo moved to the phone. The device, he explained, was a prepaid unit purchased with cash from an electronics store in Brentwood 11 months ago. It contained no personal photographs, no social media applications, no email accounts. It was a single-purpose instrument. Its call log showed recurring contact with 3 numbers. The first belonged to Nathan Voss. The second was registered to an attorney whose name Theo did not recognize. The third was a general business line for an entity called Harmony Arts Partners, LLC. I told him that Vivian's foundation was called the Harmony Arts and Education Foundation. I asked if these were the same organization. Theo shook his head. He had already checked. The Harmony Arts and Education Foundation was a registered 501c3 nonprofit incorporated in Davidson County in 2012. Harmony Arts Partners, LLC was a separate limited liability company incorporated in the state of Delaware in May of the previous year. Different entity, different registration, different listed officers. The foundation was public, transparent, and audited annually. The LLC was private, opaque, and had no public filings beyond its certificate of formation. But they share a word, Theo said. Harmony. And they share a person. Your wife is listed as the registered agent on the LLC's formation documents. She signed it herself. He turned the external monitor so I could see the phone's file directory. Among the sparse contents was a folder labeled simply Transfers. Inside it were 7 PDF documents. Each was a confirmation receipt for a wire transfer originating from Harmony Arts Partners, LLC, and sent to a receiving account at a bank in Wilmington, Delaware. The transfers were dated monthly, beginning in June of the previous year and continuing through December. The individual amounts varied, but Theo had totaled them on a separate sheet of paper that he slid across the table to me. 7 transfers, total outgoing, $1.8 million. I stared at the number. $1.8 million moved through a shell company that my wife had created in secret, funded from a source I had not yet identified, and sent to a destination that existed behind a wall of corporate anonymity designed specifically to prevent people like me from ever seeing it. Theo watched me process this. He did not offer commentary or sympathy. He simply waited, the way a good technician waits for the data to be absorbed before presenting the next result. There is more on the phone, he said, but the financial trail is where this moves beyond personal matters and into territory that involves other people's money and potentially other people's laws. I would recommend you speak with someone who specializes in forensic accounting before we go further. I asked if he had a name. He wrote it on a clean sheet of paper and handed it to me. Nolan Graves. He works out of an office on West End, former IRS Criminal Investigations Division. He is very good and he is very quiet. I folded the paper and put it in my jacket pocket. I thanked Theo and asked him to secure everything he had extracted in encrypted storage and to provide me with a complete copy on an external drive. He said it would be ready by evening. I walked out into the gray January morning and stood beside my truck and looked across the river toward the city where I had built my career and raised my family and believed for 16 years that I understood the life I was living. The skyline looked the same as it always had. The water moved beneath the bridge at the same speed. Nothing in the physical world had changed. But I was standing inside a different story now, and the chapter I had just read contained a number that changed everything. $1.8 million. And somewhere in the architecture of that money, a 12-year-old girl had lost her future. Nolan Graves kept an office on West End Avenue above a tailor shop that had been in business since 1951. The staircase was narrow, and the carpet was old, and the door at the top bore no nameplate, only a suite number in small brass digits that you would miss if you were not looking for them. I understood immediately why Theo had recommended him. This was a man who had built his professional life on the principle that visibility is a liability. He was 53, compact, with close-cropped gray hair and wire-rimmed glasses and the particular stillness of a person who has spent decades reading numbers the way my father read defendants, searching not for what they say, but for what they are trying to conceal. He had spent 19 years in the Criminal Investigations Division of the Internal Revenue Service before going private. And when I sat down across from his desk and placed Theo's external drive in front of him, he picked it up and turned it over in his hands the way a jeweler turns a stone, already assessing its weight before examining its facets. I told him everything: the hospital, the security footage, the sealed letters, the MacBook, the hidden phone, the 7 wire transfers. He listened without interrupting, without writing anything down, without changing his expression. When I finished, he plugged the drive into his computer and worked in silence for nearly 40 minutes, while I sat in a leather chair by the window and watched the traffic on West End move in its slow afternoon rhythm. Then he turned his monitor toward me and said, "Mr. Merritt, your wife built a machine. Let me show you how it works." He had organized the financial data into what he called a 3-color map, red for money that originated from the Harmony Arts and Education Foundation, blue for money that passed through Harmony Arts Partners LLC, and green for money that arrived at its final destination. The visual effect was immediate and devastating. It looked like a circulatory system, which I suppose it was. Blood flowing from a healthy body into a parasitic one. The red stream was the source. Over the previous 18 months, Vivian had authorized a series of transfers from the Foundation's operating account into what the books described as program development grants and external partnership initiatives. The language was deliberately vague, the kind of administrative vocabulary designed to pass through a board review without triggering questions. Each individual transfer was modest enough to avoid the reporting thresholds that would have flagged them automatically. She had kept every single one below the limit, spacing them at irregular intervals to avoid pattern recognition. Nolan said this technique was called structuring, and that it was a federal crime in itself. Regardless of where the money ultimately went, the blue stream was the conduit. Every dollar that left the Foundation's accounts under those program development labels arrived within 72 hours at Harmony Arts Partners LLC. The Delaware shell company Vivian had incorporated the previous May. The LLC had no employees, no office, no website, and no business activity of any kind beyond receiving money from the foundation and sending it elsewhere. It existed for one purpose only: to create distance between the source and the destination. The green stream was where the money landed, and it landed in 3 places. The first destination was a trust account at a private bank in Wilmington, held in the name of Sloan Whitfield. Nolan paused on this name and asked if I recognized it. I did not. He explained. Sloan Whitfield was the 17-year-old son of Grant Whitfield, one of the foundation's largest donors. Over the previous 12 months, $450,000 had been deposited into Sloan's trust from the LLC. In exchange, Nolan suspected Grant Whitfield's annual donations to the foundation had increased by a nearly identical amount, creating a closed loop in which a wealthy donor was effectively purchasing a scholarship for his own child, using tax-deductible contributions that were laundered back to his family through Vivian's shell company, the Reyes Girls Scholarship. The $85,000 that would have sent Lily to the Nashville School of the Arts had been one of the line items redirected to fund this arrangement. I asked Nolan to say that again. He did, slowly. And I listened to every word and felt the architecture of it settle into my understanding like a building whose blueprints I was seeing for the first time. A structure engineered with precision and cruelty and the absolute confidence that no one would ever bother to look behind the walls. The second destination was a brokerage account in Nathan Voss's name. $360,000 over 8 months. Nolan could not yet determine whether these were payments for services, investments, or simply transfers of affection expressed in currency. But the timing aligned with the relationship documented on the MacBook. Vivian was funding her lover with money stolen from a children's arts charity. The third destination was the one that made me grip the arms of the leather chair until my knuckles whitened. An insurance premium account. Nolan pulled up the policy documents that Theo had extracted from the hidden phone. 8 months ago, Vivian had purchased a life insurance policy on my father, Franklin Merritt, in the amount of $2 million. The beneficiary was not me. It was not any family member. It was Harmony Arts Partners, LLC. Upon Franklin's death, $2 million would flow directly into the same shell company that was already laundering the foundation's scholarship funds. My father was 99 years old. He had been in declining health for 2 years. The actuarial logic was simple and merciless. Vivian was not waiting for him to die. She was building a financial architecture that depended on it. His death was not a tragedy in her planning. It was a scheduled liquidity event. Nolan let me sit with this for a moment. Then he opened one more file. There is a fourth item, he said. It is smaller in dollar amount, but I think you will find it significant. He showed me a single transaction from the LLC dated 3 weeks before my father's hospitalization. A payment of $15,000 to a physician named Dr. Alan Renner. Nolan had looked up Renner's practice. He specialized in geriatric cognitive evaluations, the kind of assessments used in court proceedings to determine whether an elderly person retains the mental capacity to manage their own affairs and make their own legal decisions. Someone was paying a doctor to evaluate your father's competency, Nolan said. And given that your father has not requested such an evaluation, and given that no court has ordered one, the question becomes who initiated it and why. I knew why. If Franklin were declared cognitively incompetent, his existing legal documents, his will, his power of attorney, His trust designations could be challenged and potentially overwritten. And the person most likely to assume legal authority over his affairs in that scenario would be his daughter-in-law, the CEO of a foundation that bore the word harmony in its name and practiced none of it. Vivian was not just stealing from children. She was preparing to steal from my father. She was preparing to steal his mind, or at least the legal recognition of it, so that she could control whatever he left behind. I stood up from the leather chair. I thanked Nolan Graves. I asked him to prepare a complete documented report with source verification for every transaction and to have it ready within 1 week. He said he would. I walked down the narrow staircase past the tailor shop and into the January cold, and I stood on the sidewalk, and I breathed. 4 counts in, 4 counts out. The way I breathe when a patient is coding on the table and every second costs something that cannot be recovered. Then I called Theo Brandt and asked him to look deeper into Dr. Alan Renner. The counterattack began on a Thursday. I had spent the morning at Vanderbilt reviewing my father's overnight numbers with Dr. Simmons, the attending pulmonologist, a careful man in his early 60s who spoke about lung capacity, the way engineers speak about load-bearing walls, with respect for the mathematics involved, and a reluctance to promise anything the numbers did not support. Franklin's oxygen saturation had stabilized at 91%, which was enough to sustain him, but not enough to let anyone in that room exhale with confidence. My father was awake and lucid, and had asked me to bring him the crossword puzzle from the morning paper, which I took as a sign that his mind remained exactly where it had always been, several moves ahead of everyone around him. I was sitting in the hospital cafeteria at 11:45 when Helen Marsh called. Her voice was different from the measured teacher's cadence I had heard at the coffee shop 2 days earlier. It was controlled but tight. The voice of a woman holding something in place by force of habit. "Mr. Merritt? I received a letter this morning from an attorney representing the Harmony Arts and Education Foundation. It states that any further unauthorized communication regarding Foundation scholarship recipients will be considered a violation of confidentiality agreements and may result in legal action. It also states that my professional references on file with the Metro Nashville school system may be subject to review and correction." I asked her what correction meant in that context. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "It means they will rewrite my 31-year teaching record to say whatever they need it to say to ensure that no school in this city will ever hire me again. I am 67 years old, Mr. Merritt. My pension is secure. But my reputation is the only thing I have built in this life that I care about more than money. And your wife's attorney just told me in writing that he intends to dismantle it." I told Helen to save the letter and to send me a photograph of every page. She did so while we were still on the phone. I read it in the cafeteria with the noise of trays and conversation around me and the fluorescent lights buzzing overhead. And I recognized the language immediately. It was not legal argumentation. It was architecture. Every sentence was designed to construct a wall between Helen and the truth she carried, and to make the cost of speaking that truth higher than a retired teacher could afford to pay. 20 minutes later, Rosa Reyes called. I had not yet spoken to her directly, but Helen had given her my number the day before with my permission. Rosa's English was careful and precise, the English of a woman who had learned it as an adult and used it with the deliberate respect of someone who understood that every word in a second language carries more weight than the speaker intends. She told me she had received a hand-delivered envelope that morning at her apartment on the South Side. Inside was a cease and desist letter from the same attorney, warning her that any public statements regarding her daughter's scholarship application would constitute defamation of the Harmony Arts and Education Foundation and would result in civil litigation seeking damages. The letter also referenced Rosa's immigration status, not directly, not in a way that would constitute an explicit threat in a courtroom, but with enough implication that a woman working 2 jobs to keep her daughter clothed and fed and practicing piano in a church before dawn would understand exactly what was being said. "They are telling me to be quiet," Rosa said. "They are telling me that if I am not quiet, they will take everything." I heard Lily in the background asking her mother a question in Spanish. Rosa covered the phone and answered in a voice so gentle it made my chest tighten. Then she came back. "Mr. Merritt, I am not afraid for myself. I am afraid for Lily. She does not understand why the scholarship was taken. She practices every morning at the church, and she asks me when she will hear back, and I do not know what to tell her. She is 12. She still believes that if you work hard enough and play well enough, someone will notice." I told Rosa to keep the letter and to keep Lily practicing. I told her I was working on something and that I would not let this stand. She thanked me quietly and hung up. And I sat in the cafeteria and stared at my coffee and understood that Vivian was executing a strategy that I recognized from the operating room. When a surgeon encounters unexpected bleeding during a procedure, the first instinct is to isolate the source, clamp every vessel, cut off every pathway through which blood might escape the controlled field. Vivian was doing the same thing, except the blood she was trying to contain was the truth, and the vessels she was clamping were people. The third strike arrived at 4:17 that afternoon. I was driving back to the house in Belle Meade to retrieve a set of financial documents from the filing cabinet in the study when my phone rang with a call from an attorney I had never heard of. He introduced himself as counsel retained by Vivian Merritt and informed me that an emergency petition for a temporary restraining order had been filed that morning in Davidson County Circuit Court. The petition alleged that I had exhibited erratic, threatening, and emotionally unstable behavior in recent days, that I had forcibly broken into my wife's private furniture, and that I had removed personal electronic devices from the marital home without consent. The attorney's voice was smooth and professional, and entirely without warmth. He told me that a hearing was scheduled for the following Tuesday, and that until that time I was advised to maintain a distance of no fewer than 500 feet from Vivian, and to refrain from any direct or indirect contact with her. He suggested I retain my own counsel, and wished me a pleasant afternoon. I pulled the truck to the side of the road and sat there with the engine running and the heater blowing warm air across my hands. I looked at them. These hands had repaired mitral valves and bypassed occluded arteries and once held a child's heart, together with nothing but pressure and prayer for 6 minutes, while a nurse ran for blood. These hands had written 14 love letters that were never opened. These hands had signed every mortgage payment and every tuition check and every donation to a foundation that was now being used to launder money and silence a 12-year-old girl and prepare to steal the legal identity of a 99-year-old judge. Vivian was not merely defending herself. She was building a cage around me. If the restraining order held, I could not enter my own home. I could not access documents. I could not confront her or communicate with her or be in any room where she was present. I would be legally frozen at the exact moment I needed to move. I called Theo Brandt and told him what had happened. He listened without comment and then said, "Check your email in 1 hour. I am sending you something that changes the timeline on this entire matter." Then I called Nolan Graves and asked him to accelerate his report. He said it would be ready in 4 days instead of 7. Then I sat in the truck and waited for the hour to pass. At 5:22, my phone rang again. This time it was not a lawyer. It was not Helen or Rosa or Theo. The caller identification showed a number I did not recognize. And when I answered, A man's voice spoke with the unsteady cadence of someone who has recently discovered that the ground beneath him is not where he thought it was. "Mr. Merritt, my name is Nathan Voss. Your wife told me you were a violent man. I believed her for 8 months. I do not believe her anymore." Nathan Voss was not the man I had expected him to be. In the hours since discovering his name on Vivian's MacBook, I had constructed an image of him in my mind, the way we always do with the people who appear in the wreckage of our lives without invitation. I had imagined someone careless and confident, someone who pursued married women with the practiced ease of a man who had never been asked to account for the damage he left in his wake. But the voice on the phone was none of those things. It was the voice of a man sitting alone in a quiet room, staring at the pieces of something he had believed was real and understanding for the first time that every piece had been manufactured. He asked if I would meet him. I said yes. He suggested a diner on Gallatin Road that was open 24 hours. And I drove there through the dark January streets with the heater running and the radio off, listening to nothing but the engine and my own thoughts, which had become a kind of evidence log that updated itself continuously whether I wanted it to or not. The diner was mostly empty. Nathan was sitting in a booth near the back with a cup of coffee he had not touched. He was 51 years old, tall, with the weathered look of a man who worked outdoors. I would later learn that he owned a small construction company that specialized in historic home restoration, the kind of work that requires patience and attention to what lies beneath surfaces. The irony of that would not be lost on me. He stood when I approached. He did not offer his hand. He looked at me the way a man looks at someone he has wronged and knows it, and has not yet determined whether the apology he is about to offer will be accepted or even heard. I sat down across from him. I said nothing. I have learned in 35 years of medicine that the most important thing you can do when someone is ready to speak is to remain silent and let the truth come at its own pace. He began slowly. He told me he had met Vivian at a nonprofit board meeting in April of the previous year. She was charismatic and intelligent, and carried herself with the particular gravity of a woman who wanted you to understand that she was burdened by something she could not name. He was drawn to that gravity. He said it felt like encountering someone who needed help and was too proud to ask for it, and that he had always been the kind of man who could not walk past someone in need without stopping. By their third meeting, she had told him about me. Except the man she described was not me. The man she described was a surgeon who worked obsessively, who controlled every aspect of their shared life, who had a temper that surfaced behind closed doors in ways she could not predict or prevent. She told Nathan that I had grabbed her arm during an argument and left bruises. She showed him a photograph of bruises on her forearm. She told him that she was afraid to leave because I had access to all of their finances and because my father, a retired federal judge, had connections that could destroy her in a custody proceeding if it ever came to that. Nathan paused and looked at his untouched coffee. I believed every word. He said, "I have a sister who was in a relationship like the one your wife described. I watched my sister shrink over 3 years until she was a person I did not recognize. When Vivian told me her story, I saw my sister. I saw every woman I had ever read about or heard about or promised myself I would help if I were ever in a position to do so. And so I helped." He had given Vivian money. Not in one large sum, but in steady increments over 8 months. Transfers of $15 and $20 and $25,000 wired to an account she said was her private safety fund. The total was $180,000. He had believed he was helping a woman build an escape route from a dangerous husband. He had believed he was doing something decent and necessary and brave. I sat across from him, and I listened, and I felt something I had not anticipated, which was not anger toward this man, but a kind of grief that extended beyond my own situation into something larger. Vivian had not merely deceived Nathan. She had weaponized his compassion. She had taken the best part of him, his instinct to protect, his memory of his sister, his fundamental belief that helping a person in danger is a moral obligation, and she had converted it into currency. She had stolen from him in a way that no financial audit would ever fully capture, because what she stole was his faith in his own judgment. Nathan reached into his jacket pocket and placed a phone on the table between us. It was his personal device. He opened a folder of saved messages and turned the screen toward me. "I have kept everything," he said. "Every text she sent me, every voicemail. I kept them because I thought they were evidence of what you were doing to her. I understand now that they are evidence of what she was doing to both of us." I scrolled through the messages. The voice I recognized as Vivian's spoke from the screen in a register I had never heard before. Fragile and frightened and carefully calibrated to produce exactly the response it produced. He was so angry again last night. I locked myself in the bathroom until he fell asleep. I do not know how much longer I can do this. Nathan, you are the only person who knows the truth. Every message was a performance. Every word was a brushstroke in a portrait of a man who did not exist. A violent Douglas Merritt that Vivian had painted with the same meticulous skill she applied to foundation financial reports and board presentations, and the 14 sealed envelopes she kept in a locked drawer as trophies of a devotion she had never bothered to read. Nathan watched me read through the messages. When I set the phone down, he said something I did not expect. "There is one more thing. It might be the most important thing." I waited. "Your wife mentioned your father many times. She was not afraid of you, Mr. Merritt. I understand that now, but she was afraid of him. She said your father keeps some kind of record, a notebook. She said he writes in it every day, and that he has been documenting things about her for years. She told me that if anyone ever found that notebook, it would destroy everything she had built. She used that word specifically. Destroy. I thought about my father lying in room 317 with an oxygen cannula beneath his nose, and his white hair combed back, and his eyes that could still read a man's intentions from across a courtroom. I thought about his hands, thin and cold when I held them. Hands that had once written judgments that filled hundreds of pages with precise and devastating reasoning. A leather notebook. My father was a man who had spent 43 years maintaining meticulous records of every case, every proceeding, every piece of testimony that passed through his courtroom. The habit of documentation was not something he would have abandoned simply because he retired from the bench. It was who he was. If that notebook existed, I needed to find it before Vivian did. I thanked Nathan Voss. I told him that what he had done was wrong, but that what had been done to him was worse, and that the difference between those two things mattered. He nodded and stared at his coffee and said he would testify to everything he had told me if it ever came to that. I believed him. I drove back to the hospital through the empty streets. It was nearly 2 in the morning. The city was dark and still, and I was carrying in my mind a portrait of my wife that now had so many layers of paint that the original canvas had disappeared entirely beneath them. I arrived at the hospital at 2:26 in the morning. The parking lot held only a handful of cars clustered near the emergency entrance, their windshields glazed with frost. The lobby was empty except for a security guard reading a magazine behind the front desk and a janitor pushing a mop in slow, hypnotic arcs across the tile floor. The elevator carried me to the 3rd floor in silence, and I walked the corridor to room 317, expecting to find my father asleep. He was not asleep. He was sitting upright in bed with the overhead light turned on and his reading glasses perched on the bridge of his nose. The crossword puzzle I had brought him that morning lay completed on the tray table beside a glass of water and a pen. He looked at me as I came through the door, and his expression was not the expression of a sick man roused from rest. It was the expression I had seen 1,000 times growing up. The look he wore when court was in session and the key witness had just been called. "Sit down, Douglas." I sat in the chair beside his bed. He studied my face for a long moment, reading it the way he had spent a lifetime reading faces, not for what they chose to show, but for what they were trying to hold back. "You have been to see people," he said. "You have been gathering evidence." It was not a question. I nodded. He removed his glasses and folded them carefully, and placed them on the tray table beside the crossword puzzle. Then he said, "I need you to do something for me. Go to the house. Not your house. My house. The study on the 2nd floor. The bottom drawer of the walnut filing cabinet. The one your mother bought at the estate sale in Leiper's Fork in 1987. Beneath the hanging files you will find a false bottom. I installed it myself. Lift it and you will find what I have been keeping." I asked him what it was. He looked at me with the steady gaze of a man who had been waiting for this conversation longer than I had been preparing for it. "It is the record," he said. 3 years of it. I started keeping it when I first began to suspect what your wife was doing. And I have not stopped. I drove to my father's house in Hillsborough Village. He had lived there alone since my mother passed 11 years ago, in a brick Tudor with a garden he could no longer tend, and a study lined with bookshelves that held every volume of case law he had referenced across 4 decades on the bench. The house smelled like pipe tobacco and lemon oil and old paper, the smell of a man who had lived his entire life in the company of words. I found the filing cabinet exactly where he described it. The false bottom was fitted so precisely that I would never have noticed it without instruction. Beneath it, wrapped in a sheet of brown butcher paper, was a leather notebook. It was thick, perhaps 200 pages, bound in dark brown calfskin that had softened with handling. On the cover, embossed in small gold letters, were my father's initials, F.A.M. Franklin Augustus Merritt. I carried it to his writing chair by the window, and I opened it, and I began to read. The first entry was dated January of 3 years prior. The handwriting was my father's, the same precise judicial script that had filled thousands of pages of legal opinions over 43 years. Each entry began with a date, followed by a factual observation, followed by my father's analysis. There was no emotion in the language. There was no speculation. There was only what he had seen and heard and what he concluded from it, laid out with the same rigor he would have applied to a case brief. January 14th. Overheard Vivian on the telephone in the kitchen while she believed I was napping in the study. She referenced a transfer amount and used the phrase "before the board sees it." She ended the call when she noticed the study door was open. March 7th. Vivian presented me with a power of attorney document and asked me to sign it. She stated it was for estate planning simplification. I read the document in full. It would have granted her authority over all financial and medical decisions in the event of my incapacitation. I declined to sign. She did not ask again, but she was visibly displeased. June 22nd. Attended a foundation event at Vivian's invitation. Observed her speaking privately with a man I did not recognize. Their physical proximity and manner of interaction suggested a relationship beyond professional acquaintance. I noted the time and location and the man's approximate age and appearance. The entries continued page after page, each one a small, precise brick in a wall of evidence that my father had been constructing in secret for 3 years. He had documented overheard phone conversations, financial irregularities he noticed in foundation mailings that arrived at the house, meetings with individuals he did not recognize, and a pattern of behavior that, taken together, formed a portrait of systematic deception carried out by a woman who believed she was operating beyond the reach of observation. He had been watching her for 3 years, while she visited him on holidays and brought him gifts and kissed his cheek and called him Dad. He had been sitting in his reading chair with this notebook in his lap, recording every discrepancy with the patience and discipline of a man who understood that justice is not an event, but a process, and that the process requires evidence, and that evidence requires time. I reached the final entry. It was dated 2 months before his hospitalization, written in the same careful hand, but with a formality that distinguished it from every entry that preceded it. It was structured exactly as a judicial opinion, with headings and numbered findings and citations to the evidence contained in the preceding pages. My father had written his final judgment from a reading chair in Hillsborough Village with no courtroom, no clerk, no gallery of observers, only the leather notebook and his pen, and the authority of a mind that had never stopped serving the bench even after the bench no longer required his service. The opinion was 6 pages long. It addressed the evidence of financial fraud, the misappropriation of scholarship funds, the exploitation of a minor identified as L. Reyes, the attempted procurement of a fraudulent competency evaluation, and the sustained pattern of deception directed at his son. Each finding was supported by specific entries from the notebook, cross-referenced by date and page number. The final paragraph read as follows: "In 43 years on the bench, I have presided over cases involving men and women who believed that their position placed them above accountability. In every such case, I reached the same conclusion: no position, no title, No measure of charm or intelligence exempts a person from the consequences of deliberate harm inflicted upon those who cannot protect themselves. The respondent in this matter, Vivian Ann Merritt, has demonstrated a sustained and calculated pattern of fraud, exploitation, and betrayal. She has stolen from children. She has deceived her husband. She has attempted to undermine the legal autonomy of this court's author. The evidence is sufficient, and the verdict is clear. I find against the respondent on all counts. As I have written in every case involving a minor throughout my career, I always find for the children. I closed the notebook. I sat in my father's chair in the quiet house, and I held it against my chest, and I breathed. Outside the window, the first gray light of morning was beginning to show above the roofline of the house next door, and a cardinal was singing from the bare branch of an elm tree in the garden my father could no longer tend. And the world was turning the way it always turns, indifferent to verdicts and notebooks and the small human acts of courage that accumulate in secret until the moment they are finally needed. I drove back to the hospital. My father was still awake. I placed the notebook on the tray table beside his crossword puzzle, and he looked at it and then at me. "There is one more thing," he said. "2 months ago, I asked Desmond Hale to update my will. The previous version included Vivian as a beneficiary. The current version does not. She receives nothing. Douglas, not $1. I have made other arrangements that Desmond will explain to you when the time comes." He reached for my hand and held it, and his grip was stronger than I expected. Desmond Hale kept his law practice in a stone building on Church Street that had once been a bank. The conference room still had the original vault door mounted on the far wall, massive and ornamental now, its locking mechanism permanently disengaged. But its presence lent every meeting held in that room a certain gravity that I suspected Desmond appreciated. He was a man who understood the weight of things. I had known Desmond for nearly 20 years. He had been my father's attorney for the last decade, and before that, he had served as a clerk in my father's courtroom during the early years of his legal career. He was 58 years old, deliberate in his speech, conservative in his advice, and possessed of a loyalty to my father that I had always admired, but never fully understood until now. When I called him that morning and told him I needed to meet with him and that I was bringing other people, he asked only one question. "Does your father know?" I said yes. He said, "Then I will clear the afternoon." They arrived within an hour of each other. Theo Brandt came first, carrying a hard-shell case containing 2 encrypted external drives and a laptop loaded with the complete forensic record. Nolan Graves followed, a leather portfolio under his arm containing 63 pages of financial documentation organized into the 3-color framework he had built in his office on West End. Helen Marsh arrived next. Her manila folder now expanded to include correspondence from the Foundation's attorney and a complete copy of Lily's scholarship application with every evaluation and recommendation letter she had preserved. Nathan Voss came last. He stood in the doorway for a moment before entering, clearly uncomfortable in a room full of strangers who knew what he had done and why. But he sat down and placed his phone on the table and said he was ready to share whatever was needed. Desmond closed the conference room door and took his seat at the head of the table. He looked at each person in turn, the way my father would have surveyed a courtroom before beginning proceedings. And then he looked at me. "Before we discuss strategy," he said, I need to share something with you that your father authorized me to disclose. He asked me to wait until you had gathered sufficient evidence to act. Based on what you described on the phone this morning, that threshold has been met. He opened a document folder and removed a bound copy of my father's last will and testament, updated and executed 2 months prior. Your father's estate is valued at approximately $9.6 million. This includes real property, investment accounts, pension funds, and a life insurance policy that names you as the sole beneficiary. The previous version of this will, drafted 8 years ago, included Vivian as a secondary beneficiary entitled to 15% of the estate. That provision has been removed in its entirety. Desmond turned to a specific page and read aloud, I, Franklin Augustus Merritt, being of sound mind and clear judgment, hereby exclude Vivian Ann Merritt from any and all distributions of my estate. This exclusion is not an act of malice, but of conscience. The evidence I have gathered over 3 years, documented in my personal records, demonstrates a pattern of conduct incompatible with the trust required of a family member and fiduciary. I make this decision freely and without coercion, and I direct that it not be contested. The room was silent. Desmond continued, the estate is distributed as follows. $7.2 million to Douglas Merritt, inclusive of all real property and investment accounts. $1.5 million to a trust established for the educational benefit of Lily Maria Reyes, to be administered by an independent trustee appointed by the court. The remaining funds are allocated to 3 charitable organizations specified in the appendix, each selected by Franklin personally. He closed the document and looked at me. Helen Marsh had placed her hand over her mouth. Nathan was staring at the table. Theo sat perfectly still, his expression unchanged, processing the information the way he processed everything, as data to be filed and cross-referenced. I asked Desmond about the trust for Lily. He explained that my father had included detailed instructions. The trust would fund tuition at an accredited arts institution, private music instruction, instrument access, and a living stipend for the Reyes family through Lily's 18th birthday. The trustee would be selected by the probate court to ensure independence from any party involved in the current matter. My father had thought of everything. He had written this provision with the same precision he applied to his judicial opinions, anticipating objections and closing every loophole before anyone could find it. Nolan Graves spoke next. He laid out the financial evidence in summary, walking the room through the 3-color map, the structured transfers, the shell company, the payments to Nathan, the insurance policy, and the $15,000 payment to Dr. Renner. When he finished, Theo presented the digital evidence, the scheduled messages, the iCloud keychain reset, the deleted calendar entries, and the recovered iMessage thread. Helen provided the scholarship documentation. Nathan offered his testimony and his phone records. Desmond listened to all of it without interruption, making occasional notes on a yellow legal pad with a fountain pen that I recognized as the same model my father used. When everyone had finished, he set down the pen and folded his hands on the table. There are 2 paths forward, he said. The first is private. We present this evidence to Vivian directly, negotiate a settlement, and resolve the matter without public exposure. This path is faster, quieter, and minimizes reputational damage to everyone in this room. The second path is public. We present this evidence at the Foundation's board meeting, which is scheduled for this coming Thursday. This path is slower, louder, and exposes Vivian's conduct to the board members, the donors, and ultimately to the regulatory agencies that will be obligated to investigate once the information becomes part of the official record. He paused. The private path protects you. The public path protects the next child. I thought about Lily Reyes practicing Chopin on a church piano at 5:45 in the morning. I thought about the 3 other children Helen had mentioned, the ones whose scholarship files had also been quietly erased over the past 5 years. I thought about my father's final sentence in his leather notebook. I always find for the children. The board meeting, I said. Thursday, Desmond nodded slowly. He had expected this answer. I could see it in the way he was already reaching for a fresh legal pad to begin outlining the procedural steps, but he stopped and looked at me one more time. His voice was quiet and direct and carried the particular seriousness of a man who had spent his career watching people make decisions that could not be unmade. Douglas, once you walk into that room with this evidence, there is no version of your life that looks the way it did before. Your marriage, your home, your public standing, your wife's career, all of it changes permanently and irreversibly the moment you open that folder. I need you to understand this completely. Are you certain? I looked at the table, at the drives and the documents and the manila folder and the phone and the will, at the people who had gathered in this room because a 12-year-old girl deserved better than what she had been given, and a 99-year-old man had spent 3 years making sure the evidence existed to prove it. I am certain, I said. The Harmony Arts and Education Foundation held its quarterly board meetings in a conference room on the 4th floor of a limestone building on Music Row. The room had tall windows that looked out over the rooftops toward downtown, and the long mahogany table at its center could seat 14. On Thursday morning at 9 o'clock, 12 of those seats were occupied. Board members, program directors, the foundation's legal counsel, and at the head of the table, Vivian. She was wearing a cream blazer and pearl earrings, and her hair was pulled back, in the way she always wore it for professional settings. Precise and elegant, and communicating a woman who had thought about every detail before entering the room. She was reviewing a printed agenda when I walked through the door, and she looked up at me with an expression that moved through 3 phases in the space of a single second. Surprise, calculation, and then a smile so warm and practiced that anyone who did not know what I knew would have believed it without hesitation. Douglas, what a wonderful surprise. I did not know you were joining us today. I was accompanied by Desmond Hale, who carried a single leather briefcase. Nolan Graves followed, holding his portfolio. Theo Brandt remained in the hallway with a laptop, available by phone if technical verification was required. We had agreed the night before that the presentation would be mine. Desmond would handle legal questions. Nolan would address financial specifics. But the evidence would come from my mouth because this was my family, my father's legacy, and a child's future. And I would not delegate the responsibility of speaking the truth about any of them. The board chair, a woman named Margaret Hollis, who had held the position for 6 years, looked at me and then at Desmond and asked if this visit had been scheduled. Desmond replied that it had not, but that the matter we wished to raise fell within the board's fiduciary oversight obligations and could not wait until the next quarterly session. Margaret looked at Vivian. Vivian's smile did not change, but I watched her hands move beneath the table, a small, involuntary adjustment that told me more than her face ever would. Margaret invited us to sit. I remained standing. I began with the numbers. I placed Nolan's 3-color financial summary on the table and walked the board through it line by line. The structured transfers from the foundation's operating account, The program development grants that existed only on paper. The money flowing into Harmony Arts Partners, LLC, a shell company incorporated in Delaware by the woman sitting at the head of this table. The $450,000 laundered back to Grant Whitfield's son through a trust account in Wilmington. The $360,000 sent to a personal associate. The $2 million life insurance policy on a 99-year-old man, naming the LLC as beneficiary. I did not raise my voice. I spoke the way I speak in an operating room when the situation is critical and precision matters more than volume. I stated each fact and its source, and I moved to the next. I did not editorialize. I did not characterize. I let the numbers tell the story they had always been waiting to tell. The room changed as I spoke. I could feel it the way you feel a shift in atmospheric pressure before a storm. Margaret Hollis removed her glasses and set them on the table. The program directors stopped taking notes. Grant Whitfield, who was seated midway down the table in a navy suit with a foundation lapel pin, had gone very still. The particular stillness of a man hearing his own name in a context he had not anticipated and did not yet fully understand. Vivian interrupted me twice. The first time she laughed and said, "Douglas, darling, I think there has been a misunderstanding. Let me explain the partnership structure to the board. I appreciate your concern, but foundation finances are complex, and I would hate for anyone in this room to be confused by numbers taken out of context." I continued without acknowledging her. I placed the scholarship documentation on the table. Lily Reyes. Unanimous recommendation. Formal acceptance letter signed by Vivian herself, and then the rescission, the vague administrative language, the complete erasure of the child's records from the foundation's system. I placed Helen Marsh's preserved copies beside the foundation's empty file. The contrast was self-evident. One folder held a gifted child's entire future. The other held nothing. Vivian interrupted a second time. Her voice was harder now, the warmth stripped away, replaced by something I had never heard from her in 16 years, but that I suspect the people in this room had heard more often than I realized. This is a private personnel matter, and it is not appropriate for a board session. I am asking that my husband and his associates be excused so that we can address whatever concerns exist through proper internal channels. Margaret Hollis looked at Vivian for a long moment. Then she looked at me and said, "Continue, Mr. Merritt." I placed the digital evidence on the table. Theo's report documenting the iCloud keychain reset executed 24 minutes before the hospital called me. The 41 scheduled text messages designed to simulate affection during my absences. The recovered iMessage thread. The deletion logs showing systematic removal of files from the Foundation's cloud server. Each item was accompanied by metadata verification and a chain of custody affidavit prepared by Theo Brandt. And then I read aloud from my father's leather notebook. Not all of it. Only the final judgment. The 6 pages in which a 99-year-old retired federal judge, writing from a reading chair in Hillsborough Village with no courtroom and no authority beyond the moral weight of a lifetime spent in service to the law, found Vivian Ann Merritt guilty on all counts and closed with the words he had used in every case involving a child across 43 years on the bench. "I always find for the children." The room was silent when I finished. The kind of silence that does not merely indicate the absence of sound, but the presence of something that has fundamentally altered the air in which it exists. Grant Whitfield spoke first. His voice was controlled, but there was a tremor running beneath it like a fault line under pressure. He looked directly at Vivian. "Are you telling me that my donations to this foundation were cycled through a shell company and deposited into my son's trust account. Are you telling me that you used my family's philanthropy to create the appearance that I was laundering money through a children's charity? Vivian did not answer him. She was looking at me with an expression I had never seen on her face in 16 years of marriage. It was not anger. It was not fear. It was the look of a woman watching a structure she had spent years building collapse floor by floor, and realizing that the architect of its destruction was the man she had most completely underestimated. Margaret Hollis called for a motion to suspend the executive director, pending a full independent investigation. The motion was seconded by Grant Whitfield before Margaret finished the sentence. The vote was unanimous. 12-0. Vivian stood. She gathered her printed agenda and her phone and her leather handbag with the deliberate composure of a woman who refused to let anyone in the room see her hands shake. Though I noticed that she gripped the strap of the bag with enough force to whiten her knuckles. She walked toward the door. Desmond stepped aside to let her pass. At the threshold, she stopped and turned. She looked at me across the length of the mahogany table, past the board members who would not meet her eyes, and the documents that had ended her career, and the empty chair at the head of the table that she would never occupy again. "You have no idea what you have done," she said. I looked at her. I thought about 14 sealed envelopes, about 4 minutes and 47 seconds. About a 12-year-old girl playing Chopin in an empty church before sunrise. About my father's hand gripping mine in a hospital room, stronger than I expected. "I know exactly what I have done," I said. "I found for the children." The door closed behind her. No one in the room spoke. Margaret Hollis removed her glasses again and pressed her fingertips to her temples, and the silence held. Heavy and clean. Like the air after a long storm has finally passed through. I sat in the boardroom for 11 minutes after Vivian left. I know it was 11 minutes because Desmond checked his watch when Margaret Hollis finally spoke again, and he noted the time on his legal pad out of habit. The way men trained in courtrooms mark every transition in the record. Margaret asked if there were additional matters for the board to address. Desmond said the regulatory notifications would be prepared within 48 hours, and that the board should expect inquiries from the Internal Revenue Service and the Tennessee Department of Education within the month. She thanked him. She thanked me. She did not say she was sorry. She simply looked at the empty chair at the head of the table and said, "I should have looked harder. I should have asked more questions." I drove to Vanderbilt. The January sky was low and gray, and the streets had that midday emptiness that cities sometimes carry in winter, as though the cold has convinced everyone to stay wherever they already are. I parked in the hospital lot, walked through the lobby, rode the elevator to the 3rd floor, and entered room 317. And the moment I sat down in the chair beside my father's bed, I felt the full weight of what I had done settle over me like a surgical drape being lowered over a patient, covering everything, leaving only the small illuminated field where the work must happen. My father was asleep. His oxygen levels had improved slightly, 92% now, and the nurse on duty told me he had eaten half a cup of broth and 2 crackers for lunch, which she described as excellent progress with the kind of measured optimism that hospital staff develop after years of calibrating hope to realistic increments. I thanked her. She left. I sat in the quiet room and listened to my father breathe and watched the green line trace its steady pattern on the monitor and I waited for something I knew was coming. Vivian called at 7:43 that evening. I was still in the chair. The room had darkened as the January sun dropped behind the Nashville skyline, and I had not turned on the overhead light. My father's face was lit only by the monitor's glow and the pale blue light from the hallway coming through the half-open door. When my phone vibrated on the armrest, I looked at her name on the screen, and I let it ring 3 times before I answered. Not because I was uncertain, because I wanted to remember what those 3 rings felt like. The last 3 rings of a marriage. Douglas. Her voice was different now. Not the warm, practiced voice from the night of the hospital call. Not the hard, professional voice from the boardroom. Something else. Something beneath all the other voices. A frequency I had never heard in 16 years because she had never needed to use it. It was the voice of a woman who had exhausted every other instrument in her repertoire and was left with nothing but the raw, unmodulated sound of who she actually was. "I need to know what is going to happen with the foundation accounts," she said. I was silent for a moment. Of all the opening sentences I had imagined her speaking, this was the one I should have predicted and did not. Not "How is your father?" Not "I am sorry." Not "Can we talk about what happened to us?" The foundation accounts. The money. The architecture. The accounts are frozen pending investigation. I said, "Desmond filed the notification this afternoon. All of them, all of them." She was quiet. I could hear her breathing, and behind it the faint ambient sound of a room I did not recognize. She was not at our house. She was somewhere else. Which was, I realized, where she had always been. "I gave 16 years to that foundation," she said. I let the sentence hang in the air between us. I did not correct it. I did not point out that the foundation had been built with money I earned during 35 years of standing over operating tables. I did not mention the envelopes or the shell company or the scheduled text messages or the 15-second video at my father's bedside. She knew what she had done. The question was whether she understood what it meant, and her opening sentence had already answered that. "You could have come to me," I said. "At any point in 16 years. You could have told me you were unhappy. You could have told me the marriage was not working. You could have asked for a divorce and I would have given you one, and we could have walked away from each other with some measure of dignity still intact. Instead, you chose to steal from children and lie to a man who loved you and build a second life funded by the destruction of other people's futures. You did not have to do any of it. Vivian, that is what I cannot forgive. Not the betrayal. The choice." She did not respond for several seconds. When she spoke again, her voice had shifted one final time into a register that was almost conversational, almost casual, as though we were discussing a renovation that had not gone according to plan. "I gave you 16 good years, Douglas." "No," I said. "You gave me 16 quiet years. There is a difference." Another pause. Then she asked if I would contest the restraining order. I told her the order was irrelevant now, and that Desmond would handle the legal proceedings going forward. She asked if Franklin's will had been changed. I said yes. She asked what she would receive. I said nothing. She was quiet for a long time after that. I hung up, not with anger, not with a dramatic final statement. I simply pressed the button and set the phone on the armrest and sat in the dark room beside my father and felt the silence close around me like water filling a space where something used to be. My father stirred. His eyes opened halfway, the way they did when he was moving between sleep and waking, occupying that threshold state where the body rests, but the mind continues its quiet work. He did not ask me who had called. He did not ask what had been said. He looked at the dark window where the city lights reflected in faint, scattered points against the glass. And then he began to hum. It took me a moment to recognize the melody. It was slow and thin, carried on a breath that barely had the strength to sustain it. But the notes were unmistakable. Amazing grace. My father, who had not sung in years, who had not attended church since my mother's funeral, was humming the hymn that had been played at her graveside on a September afternoon 11 years ago, while the wind moved through the oaks and the minister spoke words that I could not afterward remember. He hummed it through once, from beginning to end, and I sat beside him and listened and did not move. When he finished, the room was very quiet. The monitor beeped its steady rhythm. The hallway light cast its pale blue bar across the floor. And my father looked at me and spoke in a voice that was barely above a whisper, but that carried in it the full authority of 43 years on the bench and 99 years of living. "The girl," he said, "the one who plays the piano, Lily." I said, "She deserves a stage, Douglas. Not a church basement at 5 in the morning. Not a phone propped against a hymnal rack. A real stage. The Ryman. That is where she should play. You make it happen." I looked at my father. His eyes were bright and clear and fixed on mine with an intensity that made his body's frailty seem like a minor detail, a technicality that the court had noted but declined to rule upon. "I will," I said. He nodded once. Then he closed his eyes and his breathing slowed, and the humming faded into sleep, and I sat in the dark beside him and thought about a 12-year-old girl playing Chopin in an empty church before the sun came up, and I began to make a plan. Grant Whitfield called me the morning after the board meeting. His voice carried the particular tension of a man who has spent the night reconstructing every decision he made in the past 2 years and discovering that the foundation beneath each one was hollow. He told me he had retained his own counsel and was cooperating fully with the regulatory review. He told me he had spoken to his son Sloan and explained what had happened, and that the boy had wept, not from guilt, but from the realization that something he believed he had earned had been purchased with money stolen from a child who had earned it more. Then he said something I did not expect. "Mr. Merritt, I want to make this right. I cannot undo what was done through my donations, but I can put resources towards something that matters. Your father mentioned the Ryman. Tell me what you need." I told him what I needed. Within 4 hours, Grant Whitfield had made 3 phone calls and secured the Mother Church of Country Music for a private event the following Saturday evening. He covered the venue fee, the technical crew, the insurance, and the security detail. He asked for nothing in return except permission to attend and to bring his son. I said yes to both. That afternoon, I drove to the south side of Nashville. Rosa Reyes lived with Lily in a two-bedroom apartment on a street lined with chain-link fences and small houses with concrete porches. The building was 3 stories, tan brick, with a laundry room on the ground floor that smelled of detergent and humidity. I climbed the stairs to the second floor and knocked on a door where the number had been reattached with a single remaining screw so that it hung at an angle. Rosa opened the door. She was smaller than her voice on the phone had suggested. A woman of 38 who looked both younger and older than her age simultaneously. The way people look when they have spent years working beyond their body's capacity to recover. She was wearing a gray sweatshirt, and her hair was pulled back, and her eyes moved across my face with a wariness that I understood immediately. Men in suits did not come to this door with good news. Every official visit she had ever received had taken something from her. I introduced myself. She invited me in. The apartment was small and clean and organized with the fierce precision of a person who has very little and refuses to let any of it fall into disorder. The kitchen table held a stack of library books and a notebook where someone had been practicing multiplication. The refrigerator was covered with drawings and school papers held in place by magnets from local businesses. A single framed photograph on the wall showed Rosa and Lily standing in front of the church. Lily's hands folded in her lap, both of them squinting slightly against the sun. Lily was not home. She was at school. Rosa offered me coffee and I accepted, and we sat at the kitchen table and I told her everything I was authorized to share. I told her about the investigation, the board meeting, and the suspension. I told her about Franklin's will. I told her that my father, a man her daughter had never met, had established a trust in the amount of $1.5 million specifically for Lily's education, and that the trust would cover tuition, private instruction, instrument access, and a family living stipend through her 18th birthday. Rosa set her coffee cup down very carefully, as though she were afraid that any sudden movement might shatter whatever was happening around her. She looked at me and her eyes filled, and she pressed both hands flat against the table and she did not speak for a long time. When she did, her voice was steady in the way that voices are steady when the person speaking has decided that falling apart is not something she can afford, regardless of the provocation. Why would he do this? He does not know us. I told her that my father had been a judge for 43 years, and that in every case involving a child, he had ruled the same way. I told her that he believed talent is sacred, and that anyone who destroys a child's opportunity for personal gain has committed an offense that no courtroom penalty can fully address. I told her that he had read Helen Marsh's description of Lily playing Chopin in the church at 5:45 in the morning, and that it had reminded him of something he had written in his notebook. The law exists to protect those who cannot yet protect themselves. Rosa wiped her eyes with the back of her hand and nodded, and did not say thank you because some things are too large for those words, and she understood that. I told her about the Ryman Saturday evening, a private concert. Lily would perform. The board members who remained. The donors who had been deceived. The people who needed to see with their own eyes what Vivian had tried to erase. Rosa listened and nodded again, and then asked the question that I realized she had been building toward since I sat down. Will Lily be safe? I promised her that she would. Lily came home from school at 3:27. She walked through the door with a backpack that was too large for her frame and stopped when she saw me sitting at the table with her mother. She looked at Rosa, Rosa said something in Spanish that I did not understand, but that made Lily set her backpack down slowly and sit in the remaining chair with the composed patience of a child who has learned that adults sometimes need time to explain things that are complicated. I told Lily that she had been invited to play piano at the Ryman Auditorium on Saturday evening. I told her that people would be there who wanted to hear her, and that everything had been arranged. She looked at her mother, then at me, and asked one question. Will there be a real piano? I drove directly from the apartment to Steinway & Sons on West End. I spoke with the manager for 15 minutes. By 4:30 that afternoon, a Steinway Model D concert grand, 9 feet long, black lacquer. The same instrument played on the stages of Carnegie Hall and the Berlin Philharmonic was scheduled for delivery to the Ryman Auditorium on Friday morning. I paid for the rental and the transport and the tuning with a personal check. And when the manager asked what the occasion was, I told him a 12-year-old girl had been waiting 6 years for a piano that deserved her. And Saturday was the night it would finally arrive. I spent Friday at the hospital with my father. His breathing had continued to improve. He was eating solid food now, small portions, and he had asked Nurse Carter to help him sit in a chair by the window for 20 minutes that morning. When I told him the Ryman was confirmed and the Steinway was being delivered, he closed his eyes and nodded once, the way he nodded from the bench when a ruling had gone exactly as the evidence demanded. That evening at 9:14, I received a message from the Ryman's security coordinator. A woman matching Vivian Merritt's description had been observed that afternoon standing outside the building's delivery entrance on 4th Avenue, watching the crew unload equipment. She remained for approximately 12 minutes, made no attempt to enter, and left on foot heading south. Security had logged the time and captured her image on the exterior camera. I read the message twice. Then I set the phone down and looked out the hospital window at the Nashville skyline and wondered what a woman who had lost everything she built still wanted badly enough to stand outside in the January cold and watch through a door she could no longer open. The Ryman Auditorium holds approximately 2,300 seats. On Saturday evening, fewer than 40 of them were occupied. The rest stretched out in long, empty rows of dark wooden pews that curved gently toward the stage. And in their emptiness, they made the room feel not smaller, but larger, as though the space itself had expanded to accommodate something that required more room than a crowd could provide. I arrived at 6:15. The Steinway sat at center stage under a single warm spotlight, its black lacquer surface reflecting the light in a soft amber pool that made the instrument look as though it were glowing from within. A technician had tuned it that morning, and when I walked past the stage, I heard him tell a colleague that in 20 years of tuning pianos, he had never worked on one that responded to adjustment the way this one did. He said it was like the instrument was listening. The guests arrived in small groups over the next 30 minutes. Margaret Hollis and 3 board members sat in the 4th row, dressed formally, speaking in low voices. Grant Whitfield entered with Sloane, a 17-year-old boy with his father's build and an expression that carried the particular weight of a young person who has recently learned something painful about the way the world arranges itself. They sat in the 6th row. Grant placed his hand on his son's shoulder and left it there. Helen Marsh sat in the 2nd row, her manila folder nowhere in sight, her hands folded in her lap. Nathan Voss came alone and chose a seat near the back. a man still deciding how close he was permitted to stand to the consequences of his own choices. Nolan Graves and Theo Brandt sat together near the center aisle, two men whose professional lives were built on invisible architectures of numbers and data. Sitting in a room built for music and waiting to hear something that no spreadsheet or hard drive could contain. Desmond Hale sat in the front row, directly below the stage. He had brought a small leather-bound notebook that I recognized as a gift from my father, and he held it closed on his knee the way a man holds a Bible at a service where the sermon has not yet begun. Rosa Reyes arrived at 6:45. She wore a dark blue dress that I suspected she had not worn in a long time, and her hair was down. And she walked through the entrance holding Lily's hand with the careful steadiness of a woman navigating terrain she had never crossed before. Lily was wearing a white blouse and a black skirt and flat shoes, and her dark hair was pulled back in the same ponytail from Helen's photograph. She looked at the Ryman the way I imagined a young sailor might look at the ocean for the first time. Not with fear, but with the sudden understanding that the world contained things far larger than anything she had previously been asked to hold. They walked down the center aisle. Rosa sat in the second row beside Helen, who took her hand without a word. Lily continued to the stage. She climbed the 3 steps and crossed to the piano and stood beside it, and placed her right hand on the edge of the instrument, the way a person touches something they have dreamed about and cannot quite believe is real. She looked at the keys. She looked at the bench. She looked out at the small audience gathered in the vast empty room. And then she sat down. She adjusted the bench with precise small movements. She placed her feet on the pedals. She rested her hands in her lap for a moment and closed her eyes. And in the silence of that moment, I heard Rosa draw a single sharp breath beside Helen. And I heard nothing else. Lily opened her eyes. She raised her hands, and she began to play. Chopin's Ballad No. 1 in G minor opens with a slow, unaccompanied introduction. 7 measures of single notes that rise and fall like a question being asked, in a language older than words. In a concert hall the size of the Ryman, played on an instrument built for exactly this kind of space. Those opening notes traveled outward from the stage and filled every corner and every empty pew and every square foot of air between the wooden floor and the vaulted ceiling. And I felt them enter my body the way a diagnosis enters your understanding. Not through the mind, but through the chest. She played from memory, no sheet music, no hesitation. Her hands moved across the keys with an authority that was not learned from tutorials on a cracked phone in a church fellowship hall, and yet had been born there, had taken root in those early morning hours before sunrise, when a 6-year-old girl sat alone on a bench and taught herself to speak in a language that the world had not yet invited her to use. The ballade built through its first theme, lyrical and singing, then moved into the second theme, darker and more urgent, the left hand driving a rhythm beneath the right hand's melody like a current running beneath a river's surface. Lily navigated the transitions with the instinct of a musician who does not think about technique because technique has become invisible. absorbed into something that operates below the level of conscious decision. She played the way I operate, not with the mind directing the hands, but with the hands knowing what the mind has not yet articulated. The piece reached its central development section, where Chopin dismantles both themes and rebuilds them into something more complex and more desperate. A passage that demands not only technical precision, but emotional courage. The willingness to sit inside dissonance and trust that resolution will come. Lily did not flinch. She leaned into the keys, and the sound that came from the Steinway was enormous and raw and beautiful, in the way that only unguarded things are beautiful. The way a child's drawing is beautiful. The way an old man's handwriting is beautiful. The way truth is beautiful when it has been stored in silence for a very long time and is finally allowed to fill a room. The final pages of the ballade are a storm. Octave passages in both hands. Cascading runs. A coda that builds to a climax so intense that it feels less like music and more like a declaration. Lily played it with her entire body. Her small frame leaning forward, her ponytail swaying with the force of her movements. Her feet working the pedals with the precision of someone who understood that sustain and silence are equally important. And when the final chord struck and her hands lifted from the keys and the last vibration traveled outward through the hall and faded into the wooden walls, there was silence. 3 seconds of absolute silence. The kind of silence that is not empty but full. The kind that occurs when every person in a room has been taken to the same place at the same time and has not yet found their way back. Then Rosa stood, and Helen stood beside her, and Grant Whitfield stood, and Sloane, and Margaret Hollis and the board members and Nolan and Theo and Desmond and Nathan Voss in his seat near the back. Every person in the Ryman auditorium was on their feet, and the sound of their applause rose through the empty pews and filled the vaulted ceiling and washed over a 12-year-old girl who sat at a Steinway concert grand with her hands in her lap and tears running down her face because she had just played the most important piece of music in her life on the most important stage in her city, and the world had answered. I stood with them. I clapped until my hands ached, and I looked at Lily Reyes, and I thought about my father lying in room 317, humming Amazing Grace in the dark. And I understood that this was what he meant. This was what he had always meant. The law exists to protect those who cannot yet protect themselves, and sometimes protection looks like a courtroom verdict, and sometimes it looks like a trust fund, and sometimes it looks like a 12-year-old girl playing Chopin on a Saturday night in the Mother Church, while 40 people stand and weep. The next morning, the Ryman's security coordinator sent me a file. Exterior camera 14, positioned backstage near the loading dock entrance, had captured footage from the previous evening. At 6:51, 4 minutes after Lily sat down at the piano, a woman entered through the delivery door using code that had not yet been deactivated from the Foundation's staff access list. She moved through the backstage corridor and stopped behind the stage left curtain. She stood there for the entire duration of the performance, visible only as a silhouette against the faint glow of the exit sign behind her. When the applause began, the silhouette raised one hand to its face in the unmistakable gesture of a person wiping tears. She remained for 37 seconds after the ovation started. Then she turned and walked back through the corridor and out the delivery door and disappeared into the January night. It was Vivian, and she was crying. I watched the footage 4 times. Each time I focused on a different detail. The first time I watched her enter, noting the precision of her movement through the backstage corridor. The way she navigated the space with the confidence of a woman who had walked it many times before, who knew exactly where the curtain gap would give her a sightline to the stage. The second time I watched her hands, which hung at her sides for the first 8 minutes of the performance, and then slowly rose to her midsection. Arms crossing over her chest in the unconscious self-holding posture that I had seen 1,000 times in patients receiving difficult diagnoses. The third time I watched the moment the applause began, the way her silhouette shifted backward half a step as though the sound had physical force, and then the hand rising to her face. The fourth time I watched her leave. She paused at the delivery door for 3 seconds before pushing it open, and in those 3 seconds, she turned her head back toward the stage one final time. And then she was gone. This was the most honest version of my wife I had ever seen, hidden in the dark, alone, crying at the sound of the very thing she had tried to destroy. And I sat in my father's hospital room with the footage paused on the screen of my phone, and I understood something that settled into me with the weight of a clinical conclusion that admits no appeal. Her tears were real. Her grief at what she heard was genuine. She had watched Lily play, and she had been moved in exactly the way that any person with a functioning soul would be moved. And it changed nothing. It changed nothing because Vivian's capacity to feel beauty had never been the problem. The problem was that her capacity to feel beauty existed in a separate compartment from her capacity to act, sealed off by walls she had built so carefully that emotion in one room never influenced decisions in the other. She could weep at Chopin and erase the child who played it and experience no contradiction, because in the architecture of her interior life, those two responses occupied different floors that shared no staircase. I closed the video. I set the phone down. My father was asleep, and the monitor traced its green rhythm. And outside the window, the January sun was setting behind the city in long bands of copper and gray. The institutional machinery had already begun to move. Nolan Graves informed me on Monday morning that the Internal Revenue Service had issued a preliminary freeze on all accounts associated with Harmony Arts Partners, LLC. The freeze was automatic, triggered by the financial disclosures Desmond had filed with the board's authorization. No further action was required from me. The system had received the evidence and the system was processing it with the impersonal efficiency of an organism that does not care about motives or feelings or the sound of Chopin in an empty auditorium. It cared only about numbers, and the numbers were sufficient. On Tuesday, the Tennessee Department of Education opened a formal investigation into the Harmony Arts and Education Foundation's scholarship program. A compliance officer contacted Desmond requesting access to 5 years of application records, award disbursements, and board minutes. Helen Marsh was notified that she would be called as a witness. Rosa Reyes received a letter assuring her that her daughter's application would be reviewed as part of the investigation and that no adverse action of any kind would be taken against her family. The letter was signed by the deputy commissioner, and it arrived at her apartment by certified mail. which Rosa told me later was the first piece of official correspondence she had ever received that did not frighten her. On Wednesday, Theo Brandt forwarded me a notification he had found in the Tennessee Board of Medical Examiners' public records. Dr. Alan Renner, the geriatric cognitive specialist who had accepted $15,000 from Vivian's shell company, had been referred for a license review based on information provided by an anonymous complaint. Theo did not tell me who filed the complaint. He did not need to. The system had found a thread, and it was pulling. And every thread led to another thread. And the fabric that Vivian had woven was unraveling with the quiet inevitability of a structure that was never built to withstand the weight of scrutiny. On Thursday, Vivian's attorney contacted Desmond to negotiate the terms of her formal resignation from the foundation. The negotiation lasted less than 2 hours. Vivian would resign effective immediately, surrender all access credentials and foundation property, and agree to cooperate with the IRS and DOE investigations in exchange for the board's agreement not to pursue a separate civil action for breach of fiduciary duty. Desmond reviewed the terms and recommended acceptance. The board approved them unanimously by email vote that afternoon. I was not present for any of these proceedings. I did not need to be. That was perhaps the most remarkable thing about the week that followed the Ryman concert. The truth, once released into the system, did not require my continued participation. It moved through channels and institutions and regulatory frameworks with a momentum that was entirely its own. The way blood moves through the body without the heart needing to think about each individual beat. I had spent my career relying on that principle in the operating room. The body knows what to do if you give it the right conditions. The system knows what to do if you give it the right evidence. I spent the week at the hospital. My father was improving. His oxygen had climbed to 94%. He was sitting up for longer periods. He had asked Nurse Carter to bring him a pen and a legal pad, and I watched him spend an hour each morning writing in the same precise judicial hand that filled the leather notebook. Though he did not show me what he was writing, and I did not ask. Some documents are composed in private and revealed only when they are complete. On Thursday afternoon, Helen Marsh brought Lily to the hospital to meet Franklin. Rosa came with them. My father was sitting in the chair by the window wearing a clean white shirt that Nurse Carter had helped him put on that morning. His hair combed back. His reading glasses folded on the windowsill beside him. When Lily walked into the room, he looked at her the way he once looked at a courtroom from the bench, with the full weight of his attention and the absolute seriousness of a man who understands that some moments are proceedings and must be treated accordingly. Lily stood beside his chair and said, "Thank you, Mr. Merritt." My father took her hand. He held it for a moment, studying her face, and then he said in a voice that was thin but carried the clarity of a man who had never in 99 years spoken a careless word, "You played beautifully, young lady. I was not there to hear it, but I did not need to be. I have been listening to you for a very long time." Lily did not fully understand what he meant. She would, eventually, but in that moment she simply held the old man's hand and smiled. And the light through the hospital window fell across both of them. And I stood in the doorway and watched my father and the child he had never met. And I thought that this was what justice looked like when it was not delivered from a bench, but from a chair by a window in a room where a man was learning to breathe again. On Friday morning, Desmond called me. "Your father's pulmonologist has cleared him for discharge. His oxygen is stable. His vitals are within acceptable range. He will need home care and monitoring, but he can leave the hospital." He paused. "Your father wants to go home. Douglas. He says he has been away long enough." The call came at 11:16 on Friday night. I was sitting in the study of my father's house in Hillsborough Village, preparing the bedroom on the first floor for his return the following morning. I had moved his reading chair to the window where the light was best. I had placed the leather notebook on the small table beside it, next to his magnifying glass and the fountain pen and a fresh legal pad. I had made the bed with clean sheets and set a glass of water on the nightstand, and arranged his medications in the order the discharge nurse had specified. I was smoothing the pillowcase when the phone rang, and I knew before I looked at the screen who it would be. "Douglas, are you there?" "I am here." She was quiet for a moment. The background was silent this time. No steel guitar, no crowd noise, no ambient sound of a life being lived in a place I was not meant to know about. Just her breathing and whatever room she had found to sit in alone. And I realized that the silence on her end was perhaps the most honest sound she had ever offered me. "I am not calling to argue," she said. "I am not calling to negotiate or to threaten or to ask you for anything. I know that those options are no longer available to me, and I am not foolish enough to pretend otherwise." I sat down on the edge of my father's bed and waited. "I watched the footage," she said, "from the Ryman. Someone sent it to me. I do not know who. I watched that girl play, and I want you to know that I remember her audition. I remember sitting in the back of the room and hearing her play and knowing in the first 30 seconds that she was extraordinary. I remember the way my chest felt. I remember thinking that this is why I started the foundation, this exact moment, this exact child. And then I remember going back to my office and looking at the numbers and the commitments and the arrangement with Grant, and understanding that the math did not work if she stayed in the program. She paused. When she continued, her voice had not broken, but it had thinned, the way a wire thins when it is carrying more current than it was designed for. "I chose the math. Douglas. I have always chosen the math. You need to understand this about me because I think you have spent the last 2 weeks trying to understand how I could do what I did. And the answer is simpler than you want it to be. I am a person who sees the architecture of things. I see how systems connect and where the leverage points are and how to make structures do what I need them to do. That is what made me successful. That is what built the foundation from nothing into something that mattered. And it is also what allowed me to sit in a room and hear a child play the most beautiful music I have ever heard, and then walk to my desk and delete her file because the architecture required it. I did not respond immediately. I sat with her words and I examined them the way I examine a heart on the operating table, looking for the defect, the structural flaw that explains why the organ is failing despite appearing intact from the outside. "You are describing yourself as a machine," I said. "I am describing myself as what I am." "No. You are describing yourself as what you chose to become. There is a difference. Vivian. A machine cannot sit in an auditorium and cry at Chopin. A machine does not stand behind a curtain in the dark and weep while a 12-year-old girl plays the piece you took from her. You felt it. You felt all of it. And you did what you did anyway. Not because you are incapable of feeling, but because you decided that feeling was less important than architecture. That was a choice. Every single day for 3 years, it was a choice. And every day you made the same one." She was quiet for a long time. I could hear her breathing change, become less controlled. And I wondered if she was crying again, and I found that I did not need to know. There was a time when Vivian's tears would have reorganized my entire evening, would have sent me across the room to hold her, would have activated every instinct I had developed in 35 years of caring for people in pain. That time had passed. Not because I had stopped caring, because I had learned the difference between pain that seeks comfort and pain that seeks permission to continue. I did love you, she said. I need you to know that. Not always, not consistently, not in the way you deserved. But there were moments. There were real moments. I believe you, I said, and it does not matter. She made a sound that was not quite a laugh and not quite a breath. It was the sound of a person arriving at a wall they have known was there for a long time, but have never touched with their own hands. What happens now? She asked. What happens now is that tomorrow morning I bring my father home. He will sit in his reading chair by the window, and he will write, and he will rest, and he will live whatever time remains to him in a house where the people around him can be trusted. Lily Reyes will receive her education. The foundation will be rebuilt by people who understand that its purpose is not architecture but children. The legal proceedings will follow their course, and you and I will sign the papers that Desmond is preparing, and we will divide what can be divided, and we will walk in different directions, and that is all. I thought about the 14 sealed envelopes. I thought about the 41 scheduled messages. I thought about the 15-second selfie video, and the 4 minutes and 47 seconds, and the cream blazer and the pearl earrings and the power of attorney. My father refused to sign, and the $15,000 paid to question his mind, and the $1.8 million that flowed through a company named Harmony that practiced none. That is all, I said. She was silent. I listened to the silence, and I let it be what it was. The end of a conversation that had started 16 years ago with promises made in good faith by at least one of the two people making them. Goodbye, Vivian. She did not say goodbye. She simply stayed on the line for another few seconds, breathing, present, occupying the last remaining moment of a connection that had already been severed in every way that mattered. Then the line went dead. I set the phone on the nightstand beside the glass of water. I finished smoothing the pillowcase on my father's bed. I turned off the lamp and walked to the doorway and stood there for a moment, looking at the room I had prepared. The reading chair, the notebook, the pen, the clean sheets, the window where the morning light would come. And I felt something I had not felt in weeks. It was not happiness. It was not relief. It was the particular calm that comes when a procedure is finished, and the patient's vitals are stable, and the instruments have been counted, and the wound has been closed, and there is nothing left to do except step back from the table and trust that the body knows how to heal if you give it the right conditions. Tomorrow I would bring my father home. I brought my father home on a Saturday morning in late January. The air was cold and clean, and the sky was the pale blue that winter sometimes offers as compensation for everything else it takes. Nurse Carter had helped him dress in his own clothes for the first time in 2 weeks. A white Oxford shirt and gray wool trousers, and the brown leather shoes he had polished himself the previous evening, using a kit I brought from his closet at his specific request. He moved slowly from the wheelchair to the passenger seat of the Silverado, one hand on my arm and the other gripping the doorframe. And when he was settled, he looked through the windshield at the hospital parking lot and said, "I have had enough of this view." The drive to Hillsborough Village took 12 minutes. I kept the speed well below the limit and took the corners gently, because I could feel every imperfection in the road translating through the suspension into his thin frame. And I did not want his homecoming to include a single unnecessary discomfort. He did not speak during the drive. He watched the city pass through the window the way a man watches a place he was not entirely certain he would see again. With attention and without sentimentality, I helped him up the front steps. He paused at the threshold and placed his hand flat against the door frame. Not for balance, but in the way a person touches something they have missed. The house smelled the way it always smelled, pipe tobacco and lemon oil and old paper. And I watched his face change as the scent reached him, softening into an expression I had not seen since before the hospital. The expression of a man who is exactly where he belongs. I guided him through the hallway to the study. He saw the reading chair by the window before I could announce it. The leather notebook was on the small table beside it, and the magnifying glass, and the fountain pen, and the fresh legal pad, all arranged in the order I knew he preferred, because I had watched him arrange them the same way for 40 years. He lowered himself into the chair with the careful deliberation of a man who understands that sitting down is, at 99, an act that requires the same respect as any other significant undertaking. He settled. He placed his hands on the armrests. He looked out the window at the garden where the elm tree stood bare against the winter sky, and where the cardinal that had been singing the morning I read his notebook was now perched on the fence post, its red body vivid against the gray wood. I stood in the doorway and watched him, and I did not know what to say. For 2 weeks I had been speaking constantly to nurses, to lawyers, to forensic specialists and financial investigators, and a retired music teacher, and a frightened mother, and a man who had been deceived by the same woman who had deceived me. I had spoken in boardrooms and hospital rooms and diners and offices and on the phone at 11 o'clock at night to a woman who would never again hear my voice. I had said everything I needed to say. And now, standing in the doorway of my father's study on a Saturday morning in January, I discovered that I had no words left. My father looked at me. He studied my face the way he always studied faces, reading what was written there, and what was hidden, and what was trying to emerge. "Sit down, Douglas." There was a second chair in the study, an old wingback that had belonged to my mother. It sat across from his reading chair at an angle that allowed both occupants to see the window and each other. I had not moved it during my preparations. It had been in that position for as long as I could remember, placed there by a woman who understood that the most important conversations in a marriage happen not face to face, but side by side. Looking at the same view, I sat down. My father did not speak. He looked out the window. The cardinal hopped along the fence post, turned its head, and flew to the elm tree. The winter light moved across the floor in a slow, pale rectangle that shifted almost imperceptibly as the minutes passed. Somewhere in the house, a clock ticked, and somewhere outside, a dog barked once and was quiet. And somewhere in Nashville, a 12-year-old girl was sitting at a piano that was not a Steinway, but that she played as though it were. Because she had learned long ago that the quality of the instrument matters less than the quality of the attention you bring to it. I waited for my father to say something, a lesson, a verdict, a piece of wisdom distilled from 99 years and 43 years on the bench, and 3 years of secret documentation, and 1 leather notebook that had saved a child's future. I waited because I was his son, and I had spent my whole life learning from him. And because the past 2 weeks had been the most important education of my life, and I assumed there would be a final lecture, he said nothing. 5 minutes passed. Then 10. The light moved across the floor. The cardinal returned to the fence post. My father breathed slowly and steadily beside me, his oxygen levels stable, his hands resting on the armrests of his chair. His eyes open and clear and looking at the winter garden with an expression of such complete and unhurried peace that I felt my own breathing begin to slow to match his, and I understood. This was the lesson. Not a sentence, not a verdict, not a quotable phrase I could carry with me and repeat to others when they asked what my father taught me during the hardest weeks of my life. The lesson was this: the silence after the truth has been spoken. The stillness after the system has done its work. The quiet after the music has ended and the applause has faded and the people have gone home, and there is nothing left to prove and nothing left to fix and nothing left to say. My father had spent 43 years speaking from the bench. He had written thousands of pages of legal opinions. He had filled a leather notebook with 3 years of meticulous evidence. He had composed a final judgment that would protect a child he had never met. He had done all of this with words, because words were the tools of his profession and his calling and his duty. And now he was teaching me that the most important thing a man can do, after he has said what needed to be said and done what needed to be done, is to sit in a chair beside someone he loves and be still. I sat with my father in the quiet study, and I watched the light move, and I listened to the cardinal, and I breathed. 4 counts in, 4 counts out. Not because I was controlling anything, because that was the rhythm my body had found, naturally and without effort, in the presence of a man who had spent a century learning how to be exactly where he was. We sat there for a long time. The morning passed into afternoon. The light shifted from pale blue to warm gold. My phone did not ring. The house held its silence like a vessel holds water, completely and without effort, and I understood. Finally, that silence is not the absence of sound. It is the presence of everything that matters, after the noise has been taken away. My father closed his eyes. I did not know if he was sleeping or simply resting in the stillness he had earned. It did not matter. I was beside him. The notebook was on the table. The pen was beside it. The garden was outside the window, and somewhere across the city, in a church on Nolansville Road, a girl was playing a piano, and the music was carrying through the morning air to places she would never see, reaching people she would never meet, doing the quiet, persistent work of beauty in a world that does not always deserve it, but always, always needs it. I closed my eyes too, and I was still.